Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Thomas Wardell had worked as a ranger at Blackwood National Forest for 6 years, and in that time, he'd heard every ridiculous superstition the locals could conjure. The October 31st of 2015 started like any other Halloween, with Thomas rolling his eyes at the warnings left on his desk that morning. Someone, probably old Henry from the visitor center, had taped a photocopied article about the Dullahan to his coffee mug. The headline read, "Ancient Celtic Death Rider, Guardian of Samhain's Gate." Thomas crumpled it without reading past the first paragraph and tossed it in the trash. "Fairy tales," he muttered, pulling on his ranger jacket. At 34, Thomas prided himself on his rationality. He had a degree in forestry management from Penn State, a spotless service record, and zero tolerance for the kind of backwoods mythology that seemed to infect every small town bordering wilderness. Blackwood was no exception. The locals treated Halloween like some kind of sacred event, warning visitors away from the trails after dark, hanging iron horseshoes above their doors, and carving protective symbols into pumpkins they placed at crossroads. Thomas had once asked what they were protecting against, and the answer, "Things that ride between worlds when the veil grows thin," had made him laugh so hard he'd nearly choked on his coffee. The morning passed in routine tasks. Thomas checked trail conditions, updated the weather reports, and fielded calls from nervous parents asking if it was safe to bring their kids to the campground Halloween celebration that evening. He assured each caller with barely concealed impatience that yes, the forest was perfectly safe. No, there were no dangerous animals in the area. And no, he had never seen anything unusual on Halloween night. The last question, asked by a trembling elderly woman, struck him as particularly absurd. Around noon, Rachel Winters checked in at the ranger station. Thomas knew her vaguely, a local woman in her late 20s who worked as a folklore researcher at the nearby university. She'd been coming to Blackwood for the past 3 weeks, documenting traditional Samhain practices in the region. Thomas found her work pretentious at best, dangerous at worst. Encouraging people to believe in old superstitions seemed irresponsible in his view. "Big night for you, I guess," Thomas said as Rachel spread a trail map across the counter. She was planning to hike out to Riders Cross, an intersection of old logging roads deep in the forest's heart, to photograph authentic jack-o'-lanterns that locals supposedly place there every Halloween. "It's not about me," Rachel replied, her dark eyes serious. "Thomas, I know you think this is all folklore nonsense, but the traditions exist for reasons. People in this region have been performing protective rituals on Halloween for over 200 years. That kind of consistency suggests something real, even if we don't understand what." "It suggests consistent superstition," Thomas countered. "Look, I respect your academic interest, but don't go filling tourists' heads with ghost stories. Someone's going to get hurt wandering around in the dark looking for magic pumpkins." Rachel's expression tightened. "The jack-o'-lanterns aren't magic. They're markers, warnings. The old Irish settlers who came here in the 1800s brought traditions from home, ways of navigating Halloween night safely. The carved turnips, later pumpkins, were meant to ward off the Dullahan, the headless horseman who rides at Samhain collecting souls marked for death." Thomas laughed, the sound harsh in the small office. "A headless horseman, right. And I suppose he carries his head under his arm and uses it as a lantern to find his victims?" "Mock all you want," Rachel said quietly, gathering her map. "But I'm following the old trails tonight. The jack-o'-lanterns will show the safe path if you know how to read them. I'll be back before midnight." She paused at the door. "Thomas, I know you don't believe, but maybe stay close to iron tonight, and don't follow any lights you see in the forest, no matter how curious you get." After she left, Thomas shook his head and returned to his paperwork. The afternoon crawled by. He decorated the visitor center half-heartedly for the evening's trick-or-treat event, stringing up plastic bats and arranging bowls of candy that seemed pointless given the remote location. Only a handful of ranger families and a few hardy campers would attend. By 4 o'clock, the October sun was already sinking toward the tree line, painting the forest in shades of amber and blood orange. Thomas noticed someone had placed jack-o'-lanterns along the path leading from the parking lot to the station. They hadn't been there at lunch. The carved faces were unlike the cheerful triangular features of typical Halloween pumpkins. These had elongated, screaming mouths and hollow eyes that seemed to stare with genuine distress. Their expressions suggested warnings rather than celebration. Thomas frowned, wondering who had placed them. Probably part of Rachel's research documentation. He made a mental note to remove them before the children arrived. They were too frightening for a family event. But when he stepped outside to collect them, Thomas stopped. There were more jack-o'-lanterns now, at least 20 of them, forming a distinct line that led from the station toward the eastern trails. Toward Riders Cross, he realized. Each pumpkin sat exactly 10 feet from the next, creating an unmistakable path. The precision disturbed him more than the number. Who had time to space them so perfectly? And when? He'd been inside for less than 30 minutes. Thomas approached the nearest jack-o'-lantern and crouched beside it. The carving was fresh. He could smell the raw pumpkin flesh. But something about it seemed wrong. The cuts were too clean, almost surgical, and the face bore an expression of such specific terror that it appeared less carved than captured, as if the pumpkin itself had been caught mid-scream and frozen. Inside, instead of a candle, a cold blue light emanated from the hollowed interior. Thomas reached toward it, then pulled back. The light wasn't flickering like flame. It was steady, phosphorescent, and when he held his hand near the opening, he felt no heat, only cold. "What the hell?" he muttered. LED lights, maybe. Some kind of chemical glow stick. But who would go to such elaborate trouble for a prank? His radio crackled. "Ranger Station, this is Henry at the visitor center. You seeing these pumpkins?" Thomas grabbed his radio. "Yeah, I'm looking at them now. You know who placed them?" Static, then Henry's voice, older and uncertain. "Nobody placed them, Thomas. They weren't here an hour ago when I drove past. They just appeared." "Pumpkins don't just appear, Henry." "On Halloween they do." A long pause. "Thomas, you know what day this is. You know the stories." "I know it's October 31st and someone's playing an elaborate joke. I'm going to clear these away before the families arrive." "Don't." Henry's voice carried a sharp urgency that made Thomas pause. "Don't touch them, and don't follow where they lead. Those are warning lanterns, boy. They mark the Dullahans' path." Thomas nearly threw the radio. "For God's sake, Henry, not you too. I expected this nonsense from Rachel, but you're supposed to be..." "Supposed to be what? Old enough to know better?" Henry's voice hardened. "I've lived in this town 73 years, Thomas. I've seen 5 Halloweens where the Dullahan rode. I've watched the lanterns appear and seen where they lead. In 1963, they led to Tom Marsh's body. In 1978, to Sarah Denton's. In 1989... "Stop." Thomas closed his eyes. "Just stop. I'm not listening to this." "Then don't listen. But don't follow those lights either. And if you see Rachel Winters tonight, you bring her back here. Because if she's out at Riders Cross when midnight comes..." Henry didn't finish. Thomas switched off the radio. His hands were shaking, though whether from anger or something else he couldn't say. This was ridiculous. Mass delusion fueled by generations of recycled folklore. He was a ranger, a man of science and reason, and he refused to let superstition dictate his actions. But the jack-o'-lanterns remained, their cold blue light strengthening as twilight deepened. The Halloween celebration was a subdued affair. Only 3 families showed up, and they left quickly, the parents casting nervous glances at the darkening forest. The children seemed to sense the adults' unease and didn't protest when they were hurried back to their cars. By 6:30, Thomas stood alone in the visitor center, surrounded by untouched candy bowls and drooping decorations. The jack-o'-lanterns outside had multiplied. He could see at least 50 now, stretching in an unbroken line toward the eastern trails. At 7 o'clock, Rachel should have called in. The protocol for researchers working after dark was simple. Check in every 2 hours. When 7:15 passed with no call, Thomas felt the first stirring of genuine concern. He tried her cell phone, no answer. He tried again at 7:30. Nothing. By 8 o'clock, he was pulling on his field jacket and loading his pack with emergency supplies. This is stupid, he told himself. But he grabbed a flashlight anyway. She probably just lost track of time. The trail to Riders Cross was 5 miles of winding path through dense forest. Thomas had hiked it hundreds of times in daylight. At night, it transformed into something alien and hostile. His flashlight beam seemed inadequate against the darkness, barely penetrating 10 feet ahead. The October night had turned cold, colder than the weather report predicted, and his breath emerged in visible clouds. Above, the moon was full, its face partially obscured by racing clouds that moved too fast for the still air below. Thomas noticed this inconsistency, but pushed the thought aside. The jack-o'-lanterns lined the trail, one every 10 feet, their blue light stronger now, pulsing in a rhythm that seemed almost organic. Like breathing, Thomas thought, then immediately rejected the idea. They were just pumpkins, carved vegetables with some kind of chemical light source. Nothing more, but he didn't stray from the path they marked. Some instinct, deeper than reason, kept him walking between the twin lines of glowing faces. The forest should have been filled with the usual night sounds, owls hooting, branches creaking, small animals rustling through undergrowth. Instead, Thomas walked through absolute silence. Even his footsteps seemed muffled, as if the air itself had grown thick and sound dampening. He stopped once, listening hard, and heard only his own heartbeat and breathing. No wind, no insects, nothing. "Rachel!" he called. His voice fell flat, refusing to carry. "Rachel, if you can hear me, respond." Silence. Thomas continued walking, his unease growing with each step. The jack-o'-lanterns were changing. He noticed it gradually. The expressions on the carved faces were shifting, becoming more frantic, more desperate. Mouths opened wider, eyes stretched into oval screams, and now instead of facing forward along the trail, they were beginning to turn, their hollow gazes following him as he passed. "LED motors," Thomas said aloud, needing to hear his own rational explanation. "Robotics. Someone's put a fortune into this prank." "But pumpkins don't have motors," a small voice whispered in his mind. "And pranks don't feel like this." At 9:15, Thomas reached the halfway point, a small clearing marked by an ancient oak. Beneath the tree sat a jack-o'-lantern different from the others. This one was massive, easily 3 feet in diameter, and instead of blue light, crimson radiance spilled from its carved interior. The face wasn't screaming, it was laughing, mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing what looked like real teeth carved into the pumpkin flesh. And it wasn't hollow. Through the opening, Thomas could see something moving inside, something that writhed and pulsed like a living organ. He stepped back, his boot catching on a root. As he steadied himself, the jack-o'-lantern's light flared, and for just a moment, Thomas saw something impossible. The tree behind the pumpkin wasn't an oak anymore. It was a gallows, and hanging from its lowest branch was a body, a headless body in archaic clothing, its neck ending in a ragged stump that dripped darkness instead of blood. Thomas blinked, and the vision vanished. The oak was just an oak. The jack-o'-lantern's light dimmed to a steady crimson pulse, but Thomas's hands were shaking as he pulled out his radio. Henry, are you there?" Static then. "Thomas, where are you?" "About halfway to Riders Cross. Henry, something's wrong out here. The pumpkins, they're..." He stopped, unsure how to explain what he'd seen without sounding insane. "Get back, son. Right now. Turn around and come back." "I can't. Rachel's out here somewhere. I have to find her." Rachel made her choice. She knew what night this was, but you don't have to follow her. "That's not how this works," Thomas snapped. "I'm a ranger. I don't leave people in the forest." "Not people out there tonight, Thomas. Not anymore." Henry's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "It's after 9. You've got less than 3 hours until midnight, when the veil is thinnest, when he rides." Thomas switched off the radio. His rational mind screamed that this was mass hysteria, that he was letting local legends infect his judgment. But his body betrayed him. His heart raced, his palms sweated despite the cold, and every primitive instinct demanded he turn back. Instead, he pushed forward, following the trail of jack-o'-lanterns deeper into Blackwood Forest. The path descended into a ravine, where centuries-old trees formed a canopy so thick that even moonlight couldn't penetrate. Thomas's flashlight became his only illumination beyond the jack-o'-lantern's eerie glow. And now he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There were 2 trails of pumpkins. The original path continued straight ahead, but a second line branched off to the left, leading deeper into the ravine where no marked trails existed. The new path's jack-o'-lanterns were different. Their faces bore expressions of invitation rather than warning, mouths curved in beckoning smiles, eyes that seemed to wink and call. "Come this way," they seemed to say. "This is the path you seek." Thomas knew, with absolute certainty, that the inviting path was wrong. Every instinct screamed danger, but that was the direction where he heard it, a sound that finally broke the oppressive silence. A woman's scream cut short. "Rachel, no," Thomas breathed. He fumbled for his radio. "Henry, I heard her." Rachel screamed. "She's down in the ravine." "The ravine?" Henry's voice carried pure horror. "Thomas, that's where it happened, where the Dullahan was first seen in these woods back in 1847. Irish immigrants reported a headless horseman riding through the ravine, carrying victims across his saddle. That's why they started the jack-o'-lantern tradition, to mark safe paths away from—" "I don't care about legends," Thomas shouted. "Rachel is down there and she needs help." He plunged down the inviting path, ignoring the warning lanterns that seemed to scream silently as he passed. The descent was steep, treacherous with loose stones and exposed roots. Twice Thomas nearly fell, catching himself at the last moment. The jack-o'-lanterns here were closer together, their smiling faces growing wider, more predatory. And now he saw that the blue light emanating from them wasn't light at all. It was cold, tangible, spilling from the carved mouths and eyes like luminous fog that coiled around his legs as he passed. The ravine bottom was a nightmare landscape. Dead trees stood like skeletal fingers reaching toward the hidden sky. The ground was bare earth, packed hard and cold, with no vegetation except patches of mushrooms that glowed with the same sickly phosphorescence as the jack-o'-lanterns. And in the center of the ravine stood Ryder's Cross, not the intersection of logging roads Thomas expected, but a literal crossroads, 2 ancient stone paths meeting at perfect right angles, surrounded by a circle of jack-o'-lanterns that numbered in the hundreds. Rachel stood in the center of the crossroads. "Rachel!" Thomas stumbled forward, relief flooding through him. "Thank God, I thought—" He stopped. Rachel wasn't moving. She stood perfectly still, facing away from him, her head tilted at an angle that wasn't quite right. Around her, the jack-o'-lanterns were screaming. Thomas could hear it now, not with his ears, but somehow inside his skull, a chorus of warning shrieks that made his teeth ache. "Rachel," Thomas approached slowly. "Are you okay?" She turned. Her face was blank, eyes unfocused, mouth slightly open, but she was unharmed, breathing, alive. Thomas felt another wave of relief. "We need to leave," he said, reaching for her arm. "Now, this place is—" Rachel's eyes suddenly focused, locked on something behind Thomas. Her expression transformed into absolute terror. "Run," she whispered. "Oh God, Thomas, run!" Thomas spun around. The Dullahan sat astride a horse at the edge of the ravine, silhouetted against the night sky. The horse was wrong, too large, too dark, its eyes burning with crimson light that matched the jack-o'-lantern beneath the oak. The rider was worse. He wore ancient armor, corroded and stained, and where his head should have been was nothing, just a ragged neck stump that ended in shadow. But in his left hand, held high like a lantern, the Dullahan carried his own head. The face was gray, desiccated, but the eyes were alive, burning with the same crimson light as the horse's, and they were fixed directly on Thomas. "No," Thomas heard himself say. "No, this isn't real. This isn't possible." The Dullahan's mouth moved. No sound emerged, but Thomas heard the words anyway, felt them resonate in his chest like thunder. The veil is thin, the marked must cross. The horse descended into the ravine, each step causing the ground to tremble. As it moved, the boundary between worlds seemed to blur. Thomas saw double images, the ravine as it was, dark and cold and earthly, overlaid with something else. A realm of mist and shadow where countless figures waited, watching with hollow eyes. The dead, Thomas realized with sick certainty. He was seeing the land of the dead bleeding through into the living world. "This is Halloween," Rachel whispered beside him. She had moved without Thomas noticing, positioning herself between him and the approaching rider. Samhain, the night when the veil between worlds grows thin enough for him to cross. The Dullahan rides on Halloween to collect souls marked for death. The jack-o'-lanterns, the real ones, the ones meant to ward and warn, tried to keep you away. But you followed the false path, the ones he created to lure you here. "You're talking about folklore," Thomas said, but his voice shook. "Celtic mythology. It's not real, it can't be real." "Look at him!" Rachel grabbed Thomas's shoulders, forcing him to face the approaching rider. "Look and tell me what you see." Thomas looked. The Dullahan was 20 feet away now, close enough that Thomas could see the details he'd been denying. The armor wasn't costume metal. It was real, ancient iron, pitted with age and battle damage. The horse's breath emerged as clouds of frost, and the head, held high in the rider's gauntleted hand, was watching Thomas with an intelligence that went far beyond any Halloween decoration or theatrical trick. This was something old, something that had existed long before Thomas's rational worldview was invented, something that cared nothing for his skepticism. "How?" Thomas asked, his certainty crumbling. "How is this possible?" "Tonight the boundary weakens," Rachel said. "Halloween, Samhain, is the cross-quarter day, the hinge between autumn and winter, life and death. The ancient Celts knew this. They understood that one night a year the barrier between our world and the other world grows thin enough to cross. That's why they carved turnips into lanterns, to mark safe paths and ward off those who ride between worlds. When Irish immigrants came to America, they brought the traditions with them, found they were needed here too, because whatever force creates the thin veil exists everywhere, not just in Ireland." The Dullahan stopped his horse 10 feet from the crossroads center. He raised his head higher, and when he spoke, his voice was the sound of autumn wind through dead leaves, of earth closing over coffins, of final breaths. "Two marked, two must cross. The tithe is due." "Tithe?" Thomas's mind raced. "What tithe?" Rachel's voice was steady despite her fear. "The old legends say the Dullahan serves as a psychopomp, a guide for souls transitioning between worlds. On Samhain, when the veil is thinnest, he collects those marked for death, not killing them, but claiming those already fated to die. He's not evil, Thomas. He's just inevitable, like death itself. Then why is he here? Neither of us is dying, aren't we?" Rachel pulled something from her pocket, a piece of paper, folded and worn. She handed it to Thomas. "I found this at Riders Cross 3 weeks ago. It's why I've been researching the Halloween traditions here. Look at the names." Thomas unfolded the paper with shaking hands. It was old, the ink faded but legible. A list of names, written in an archaic hand with dates beside each. Thomas Marsh, 1963. Sarah Denton, 1978. Names Henry had mentioned on the radio. And at the bottom of the list, in fresher ink that still looked wet, Rachel Winters, 2015. Thomas Wardell, 2015. "Someone marked us," Rachel said quietly. "Marked us for collection on Halloween night. The Dullahan doesn't choose randomly. He only claims those whose names are written, those whose fates are sealed." "That's insane," Thomas said, but he was staring at his own name written in handwriting he didn't recognize. "Who would do this? Why?" The Dullahan's horse stamped, impatient. The rider's head swiveled, focusing on Thomas with those burning eyes. "The marked must cross. It is written. It is Halloween. The tithe must be paid." Around them, the jack-o'-lantern's light intensified. Thomas saw now that they formed a perfect circle around the crossroads, and within that circle, the boundary between worlds had completely dissolved. He could see both realms simultaneously, the ravine in Blackwood Forest and something else, a gray landscape of mist and shadow where countless figures moved. Some he recognized, rangers who'd died in the forest years ago, their faces translucent but familiar. Others were older, dressed in clothing from past centuries, indigenous peoples and settlers and miners and loggers, all waiting in that realm between life and death. "The tithe has always been paid," a voice said. Thomas spun to see Henry emerging from the trees at the ravine's edge. The old man looked ancient in the jack-o'-lantern's light, his face carved with lines of grief and guilt. "I'm sorry, Thomas, I'm so sorry. But someone has to cross, someone has to go with him when he rides. That's the price for keeping the Veil stable, for preventing both worlds from colliding completely. The Dullahan doesn't take souls. He guides them across when the boundary is weakest. Without him, without the tithe, the dead would spill into the living world unchecked." "You did this," Thomas said, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "You wrote our names." "My name was on the list for 1989, Henry said, his voice breaking. "My wife and I both marked. Halloween night we came out here, saw the Dullahan waiting, but I couldn't let her go, so I bargained. Offered to mark 2 others, 2 souls to cross in our place. He accepted. He always accepts. The tithe must be paid, but the specifics are negotiable." "You condemned us to die?" Thomas's shock was giving way to fury. "For what? To live a few more years?" 36 years, Henry said. "My wife died of cancer last spring. She lived 36 years more than she would have. We had children, grandchildren, a life together. And all it cost was our lives," Thomas shouted. "You murdered us." "I marked you," Henry corrected quietly. "The Dullahan claims you. There's a difference." The Dullahan's horse advanced another step. The rider raised his head higher, and now Thomas saw that the head was changing, features shifting like smoke. For a moment it wore Thomas's face, then Rachel's, then Henry's, cycling through all the souls it had claimed over centuries. "It is midnight," the Dullahan said, and Thomas realized with horror that it was true. Time had been slipping, distorting, compressed by the thin veil. Hours had passed in what felt like minutes. "The veil is thinnest. The marked must cross. Now." Rachel grabbed Thomas's hand. "There might be a way," she whispered urgently. "The old stories, some say if you can reach dawn, if you can survive until the sun rises and the veil strengthens again, the marking loses its power. Halloween ends at sunrise." "How long until dawn?" Thomas asked. 7 hours. Maybe 6. "So we run? Try to survive? Or we bargain," Rachel said, looking at Henry. "He did. If one soul crosses, maybe the other can be spared." "No." Thomas's voice was firm despite his terror. "Absolutely not. I won't sacrifice you, and I won't let you sacrifice yourself for me." "Then we both cross," Rachel said. "Or we both run." The Dullahan was listening. Thomas could feel the weight of that inhuman attention, the ancient intelligence behind those burning eyes. This wasn't a mindless monster. It was something that understood, that perhaps even sympathized, but was bound by rules older than human civilization. "What happens if we refuse?" Thomas asked. "If we just walk away?" "No one walks away," Henry said. "I've seen people try. They make it 10 feet, maybe 20, before he rides them down. The horse is faster than anything living. And if you somehow escaped, if you lasted until dawn, there's always next Halloween. The marking doesn't expire." Thomas looked at Rachel, saw his own terror reflected in her eyes, and made a decision. "Then we don't run," he said. "And we don't bargain. We break the rules. You can't—" "We mark someone else," Thomas said, pulling out his pen. "Right now. If the tithe must be paid, if someone must cross, then let it be the one who started this. Let it be the one who condemned innocent people to save himself." He advanced on Henry, who backed away, horror dawning on his weathered face. Thomas, no. You don't understand. The marking has to be done on Halloween, at Ryder's Cross, witnessed by the Dullahan. Thomas finished. Who's right here? Who can witness this? He grabbed Henry's wrist, twisted it, began writing on the old man's palm despite his struggles. I mark Henry Callahan for... The Dullahan moved faster than thought. One moment he was 10 feet away. The next, his horse was between Thomas and Henry, the massive animal's bulk forcing them apart. The rider's head swiveled, fixing Thomas with a gaze that made him forget how to breathe. The tithe must be willing, the Dullahan said, or marked in contract before the night. You cannot mark in anger and revenge and fear. This has always been the rule. Then the rule is unjust, Thomas shouted. Why should the innocent die while the guilty live? For a long moment, nothing moved. The hundreds of jack-o'-lanterns pulsed in perfect synchronization, their light waxing and waning like a massive heartbeat. In that frozen instant, Thomas saw the true nature of what faced him. Not a monster, not evil, but something far more terrible. Inevitability itself, the mechanism by which death claims the living, indifferent to justice or mercy or any human concept of fair. Then the Dullahan's mouth moved, and when it spoke, its voice carried something that might have been regret. I do not choose who crosses. I only guide those who must. The marking is not mine. The tithe is not mine. I am only the ferryman, bound to my duty as you are bound to yours. Then who does choose? Thomas demanded. Who makes the rules? The veil itself, Rachel said softly. It's a natural phenomenon, Thomas. Like gravity or entropy. The barrier between life and death weakens on certain nights and something has to stabilize it. The tithe, souls crossing from life to death when the boundary is thin, it's like a pressure valve. It prevents both worlds from colliding completely. So we die to maintain cosmic balance? That's the explanation? Yes, the Dullahan said. Or no, or both. I do not know why the veil exists, or why it thins, or why the tithe stabilizes it. I only know that it does, and has, since before your kind walked this land. And I know that at midnight on Samhain I ride, and I guide those marked to cross. Thomas felt his anger draining away, replaced by a numbing despair. He'd spent his entire adult life believing the universe operated on rational principles, that understanding and reason could solve any problem. Now he faced something that made a mockery of that worldview, not through malice, but through simple, ancient fact. The rules existed before him and would exist after him, and no amount of skepticism or denial could change them. There is another way, Henry said quietly. Not a good way, but a way. Everyone turned to look at him. The old man seemed to have aged a decade in the past few minutes, his guilt finally showing plainly on his face. The marking can be transferred, Henry said. If the marked one willingly accepts another's mark, takes on their fate. It's how I saved my wife. I convinced someone else to accept her marking. A young man from out of state, someone who didn't understand what it meant. By the time he realized, it was too late. His voice broke. I've lived with that for 36 years. Lived with knowing I condemned an innocent man so my wife could live. And you want us to do the same? Rachel's voice was ice. Find some other victim? No, Henry said. I'm saying I'll take the marking. Both of them. I'm 73 years old. I've lived my life. Let an old man's death mean something for once. The Dullahan's horse shifted, and Thomas swore he saw something like approval in those burning eyes. The tithe must be willing, the rider repeated. Do you offer yourself willingly, Henry Callahan? I do, Henry said, stepping forward into the circle of jack-o'-lanterns. I offer myself in place of Rachel Winters and Thomas Wardell. Let their names be erased from the list. Let mine be written. The paper in Thomas's hand began to burn. Not with flame, but with cold blue light, the same luminescence that filled the jack-o'-lanterns. He watched as the ink shifted, letters rearranging themselves. His name and Rachel's faded, becoming transparent, then vanishing entirely. In their place, in handwriting that seemed to write itself, Henry Callahan, 2015. "It is accepted," the Dullahan said. "Henry Callahan is marked. Henry Callahan will cross." "No," Thomas said, surprising himself. "Wait, this isn't right either. Henry made a terrible choice, but he doesn't deserve—" "Yes, I do," Henry interrupted. "Thomas, I marked you to save myself. That debt has been unpaid for 36 years. Let me pay it now. Let me do one good thing before I go." The Dullahan dismounted. It was the first time Thomas had seen him leave his horse, and the sight was wrong in ways Thomas couldn't articulate. The rider moved with a fluidity that defied anatomy, his headless body somehow navigating the terrain perfectly despite having no eyes. He approached Henry, who stood his ground, despite obvious fear. "It is time," the Dullahan said, reaching out with one gauntleted hand. "Wait," Rachel said. "At least tell us what happens. After he crosses? Is there anything beyond, or is it just ending?" The Dullahan paused. His head, still held high in his left hand, turned to face her. For the first time, something like expression crossed those dead features. Not quite sympathy, but understanding. "I am only a guide," he said. "I see the crossing, not the destination. But those I have carried speak of rest, of reunion with those who went before, of continuation in forms your living minds cannot comprehend. Or they speak of nothing, or they speak of everything. The answer differs for each soul. Perhaps the question itself is flawed." Henry took the Dullahan's hand. The moment they touched, the old man's body went rigid. His eyes widened, not with fear, but with awe. "Oh," he breathed. "Oh, I see. Margaret? Margaret, is that you?" The Dullahan lifted Henry effortlessly, settling him across the massive horse's saddle. Henry seemed to weigh nothing, his form already translucent, halfway between worlds. "Margaret," Henry said again, and now Thomas saw that the old man was looking at something invisible, seeing into that other realm where the dead waited. "I'm sorry I took so long. I'm sorry I was so afraid." The Dullahan remounted behind Henry, his head returned to its place, or lack thereof, atop his shoulders. The horse turned, facing away from the crossroads, toward that gray landscape of mist and shadow that only Thomas could see now, the veil so thin as to be nearly transparent. "Wait," Thomas called. "Will we see him again? Will he still exist somewhere?" The Dullahan looked back, and though he had no head to turn, Thomas felt that burning gaze one final time. "All things exist somewhere," the writer said. "All souls persist. He will be where all crossed souls go. In the place between, in the memories of the living, in the land of the dead. He will be everywhere and nowhere, until you cross as well and know the truth directly." "One more question," Thomas said, needing to know. "Why the jack-o'-lanterns? Why the faces, the lights, the warnings?" "They are not mine," the Dullahan said. "They are yours, carved by those who crossed before, by souls who remember the living and wish to guide them. The warning lanterns mark safe paths. The false ones, the ones that led you here, those are different. Those are carved by the living who seek to condemn others, who try to save themselves by offering souls in their place. The lanterns show truth, that death is inevitable, that the crossing must come, but that there are better and worse ways to meet it. The faces scream because they remember fear, but they light the way because they also remember love." With that, the Dullahan rode forward into the mist. Thomas watched as horse and riders moved between worlds, becoming transparent, then translucent, then simply absent. Not disappearing, but crossing, moving into a space where Thomas's eyes could not follow. Henry's last words drifted back. "Thank you. Tell them I'm sorry. Tell them it wasn't their fault." Then he was gone, and the veil snapped shut with an almost audible sound like a door closing. The gray realm vanished. The ravine was just a ravine again, dark and cold and utterly earthly. And the jack-o'-lanterns began to go out, One by one, their purpose fulfilled for another year. Thomas and Rachel stood in silence, processing what they'd witnessed. Slowly, dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Halloween was ending. Samhain was passing. The veil was strengthening again, sealing the dead away from the living for another year. Did we imagine that? Thomas finally asked, though he knew the answer. No, Rachel said. We saw what people in this region have been seeing for 200 years. We saw what the old traditions tried to prepare us for. They found their way out of the ravine as true dawn broke, following a new line of jack-o'-lanterns that appeared spontaneously. These, with gentler faces, sad but kind, guiding them back to the marked trails. Thomas recognized this phenomenon now. The dead, those who had crossed before, helping the living navigate the aftermath of Halloween night. When they reached the ranger station, they found it empty. Henry's truck was still in the parking lot, but the man himself would never return. Thomas wrote the report carefully, knowing it would never be believed. How Henry had gone missing during Halloween night. How, despite extensive searches, no trace of him would ever be found. It was a story that had repeated in Blackwood Forest for generations, though Thomas had been too skeptical to notice the pattern. In the days that followed, Thomas began researching in earnest, reading everything Rachel had compiled about Samhain traditions. He learned about the ancient Celtic practices, about the ways different cultures understood the thinning veil, about the universal human attempt to navigate the boundary between life and death. He learned that skepticism wasn't wisdom when it closed your mind to truths that predated scientific understanding. And every year after, on October 31st, Thomas helped maintain the traditions. He placed jack-o'-lanterns along the trails, carved with warning faces to guide visitors away from dangerous paths. He told the stories to those who would listen, passed on the knowledge that Henry had tried to share. He never mocked the old beliefs again, because Thomas had learned what all the warning lanterns tried to teach, that some things are true whether you believe in them or not, that the universe operates on principles far older and stranger than human reason can encompass, and that on Halloween night, when the veil grows thin and the dead walk close to the living, the only rational response is not skepticism, but respect. Rachel returned to Writer's Cross every Halloween, documenting the jack-o'-lanterns that appeared spontaneously, recording their positions and expressions. She published papers that the academic community dismissed as folklore documentation, never quite believing her conclusion that the lanterns were not human-carved but manifestation of some boundary phenomenon. Messages from those who had crossed trying to help those still living. Thomas kept Henry's note, the one with the shifting names, locked in his desk. Sometimes on quiet nights he'd take it out and read it, watching as additional names appeared year by year. Other people marked, other souls who crossed when the Dullahan rode. He understood now that he couldn't stop it, couldn't prevent the tithe from being paid, but he could help people understand, could pass on the wisdom that cost Henry his life to teach. And every Halloween at midnight, if Thomas was anywhere near Writer's Cross, he would see them. A horse and rider silhouetted against the moon, the rider headless, his hand held high like a lantern to guide the marked souls home. Sometimes there was someone across the saddle, sometimes not. But the Dullahan always rode, had always ridden, would always ride when Samhain came and the veil grew thin. Thomas stopped being an arrogant skeptic that Halloween night. He became something else, a guardian of traditions, a keeper of truths that science couldn't explain, a man who understood that reality was far stranger and more terrible and more beautiful than he'd ever imagined in his days of certainty. And when children asked him why people carved jack-o'-lanterns, Thomas told them the truth. To remember that death is not an ending but a crossing, that the boundary between worlds is thinner than we think, and that on Halloween night, the faces we carve scream not just from fear but from love, a warning to the living from those who've already crossed, saying, be careful, be kind, be ready, because one day you too will ride between the worlds, and the only question is whether you'll face it with courage or terror. The jack-o'-lanterns still appear every Halloween at Writer's Cross, dozens of them, marking paths both true and false. Thomas and Rachel check them each year, removing the false ones that those desperate to save themselves have added. maintaining the authentic warnings that the dead provide. It's become their tradition, their tithe to the community, their way of honoring Henry's sacrifice. Because that's what Halloween really means. Thomas finally understood. Not costumes and candy, but a night of remembering, of honoring, of acknowledging that the line between life and death is thinner than we pretend, and that those who've crossed before us still care, still watch, still try to guide us with their screaming, loving, warning faces carved in pumpkins and lit with cold blue fire. The Dullahan rides every Samhain. He always has. He always will. And the jack-o'-lanterns will always light the way, both toward crossing and away from it, because that's what love does. It warns and guides and remembers, even after death, even from beyond the veil, even on Halloween night when the two worlds briefly touch and souls pass between them like whispers in the dark. I hope this Halloween literary tale has haunted you. If you appreciated this seasonal terror, consider following for more Halloween stories. Which moment of this cursed night terrified you most? What do you think really happened when the veil was thin? Happy Halloween. Matthew Chen had been a ranger at Blackwood National Forest for exactly 4 months when October 31st arrived. The morning air carried that particular autumn crispness that made everything feel both alive and dying at once. He'd worked through summer's oppressive heat, witnessed the gradual transformation of the canopy into a cathedral of gold and crimson, but nothing had prepared him for the atmosphere that settled over the forest as Halloween approached. The ranger station was unusually quiet that morning. His supervisor, Dale Hutchins, had the day off, something Matthew found odd given it was a holiday weekend when visitor traffic typically spiked. The only other ranger on duty was Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran who'd been conspicuously avoiding him since mid-October. When Matthew had asked her about protocols for Halloween night, she'd given him a look he couldn't quite read, something between pity and fear, before handing him a laminated card with emergency numbers and walking away without another word. The card was worn smooth at the edges, as though it had been handled many times over many years. Beneath the standard emergency contacts, someone had written in faded ink, "Stay inside after dark. Lock the doors. Do not investigate the bonfires." Matthew had laughed it off as hazing for the new guy. Every workplace had its traditions, its inside jokes designed to test the rookie's nerve. But as he drove his patrol route that morning, past carved pumpkins left at trailheads and clusters of teenagers already gathering for evening festivities, he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching him with ancient, patient eyes. The first call came in at 11:30. A hiker had found something disturbing near the old-growth trail. A circle of stones arranged around a blackened patch of earth, with symbols carved into the surrounding trees. Matthew took the report, assured the shaken hiker that it was probably just teenage pranks, and made a note to check it out. The second call came 20 minutes later. Different trail, same discovery. By noon, he'd received 5 reports of similar findings scattered throughout the forest's northern section. He tried calling Maria, but her phone went straight to voicemail. Dale didn't answer either. The ranger station felt larger and emptier than it should have, as though the walls had expanded in the autumn light. Matthew pulled up the incident database on his computer, intending to file reports, and that's when he noticed the pattern. October 31st, 2002. Hiker Amanda Reeves, age 24, reported missing. Last seen on Old Growth Trail, never found. October 31st, 2007. Camper David Morrison, age 29, disappeared from Deadman's Hollow campsite. Tent found undisturbed, personal effects inside, never found. October 31st, 2012, Amanda Reeves. No, that couldn't be right. He scrolled back up. The name was different. Amanda Torres, age 26, missing from Ravens Peak Overlook, never found. October 31st, 2017, Amanda Chen, age 23. His hands went cold. Chen was his surname. The coincidence sent ice down his spine, but he kept reading. Missing from the same region where he'd received reports of stone circles this morning. Never found. Every 5 years. Every Halloween. Always someone named Amanda. Matthew's phone rang, making him jump. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something compelled him to pick up. Blackwood Ranger Station. Static crackled on the line, and beneath it, something that might have been breathing. Then a voice, female, distant as though speaking from the bottom of a well. They're preparing. The circles are ready. She's been marked. Who is this? Hello? The line went dead. Matthew sat in the quiet station, his heart hammering against his ribs. This had to be an elaborate prank. Maria and Dale had probably set this up to scare him, some twisted ranger initiation. But his hands were shaking as he pulled up the park's visitor log for the week. There. Checked in 2 days ago. Amanda Rodriguez, age 25, solo hiker, planned route through the northern trails. Expected checkout November the 2nd. The pattern held, 2022. 5 years since the last disappearance, and an Amanda was in the forest. Matthew grabbed his radio, his jacket, his keys. The logical part of his brain insisted this was coincidence, pattern seeking in random data. But the older, deeper part, the part that still feared the dark, knew better. He tried Maria's phone again as he climbed into his truck. This time she answered on the first ring. Matthew. Her voice was tight. Where are you? Station. Maria, I found something in the database. People disappearing every Halloween, every 5 years, all named. Stop. The word cracked like a gunshot. Don't say it out loud, don't speak the name. You'll draw their attention. Whose attention? Maria, what the hell is going on? Silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of wind through phone speakers. When Maria spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. There are things in these woods older than the park, older than the rangers, older than the European settlers who thought they could tame this land. The native peoples knew. They had their own names for this night, their own ways of showing respect. Then others came, brought their traditions, twisted them. Samhain became Halloween, the sacred became profane. You're talking about the stone circles. I'm talking about the cult. They've been here for generations, Matthew. Hidden, waiting. Every 5 years, when the veil is thinnest, they make their offering. They believe it grants them power, immortality, communion with something that should never be communed with. The Park Service knows. We've always known. That's why they schedule senior rangers off on Halloween. Why they always put the newest, most expendable person on duty. Matthew's mouth went dry. You're saying I was set up. I'm saying I'm sorry. I argued against it, but Dale said it was tradition. He said if we don't have someone here, someone watching, then the cult will know we've abandoned our post, that we've given up. At least this way there's a witness, someone to call it in when what? When they take her, and they will take her, Matthew. They always do. The best thing you can do is stay in the station, lock the doors, wait for dawn. If you try to stop them, you'll just become another disappearance the Park Service has to explain away. There's a woman out there. There's always a woman out there. They make sure of that. They have people everywhere. In town, in the park system, probably even in law enforcement. How else do you think they've gotten away with this for so long? The disappearances are investigated, sure, but they never find anything. They never find anyone. Because by dawn, there's nothing left to find. Matthew's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. I can't just let someone die. Then you'll die too. And next Halloween they'll put some other rookie in your place and the cycle will continue. Maria's voice broke. I've seen it before, Matthew. 20 years ago, when I was new, I tried to help. I followed the fires into the woods. What I saw... She choked on the words. I ran. I've been running ever since. Living with the knowledge that I could have done something. Should have done something. Don't make my mistake. Don't look. Don't interfere. Just survive until morning. The line went dead. Matthew sat in the truck outside the ranger station as the afternoon light began its long slide toward evening. The autumn sun, which had seemed so beautiful that morning, now looked like a wound bleeding out across the sky. He thought about Maria's words, about Dale's conspicuous absence, about a system so corrupt or so terrified that it had made peace with ritual murder. He thought about Amanda Rodriguez, whoever she was, hiking through these woods with no idea that she'd been marked, chosen, fed into a machine of ancient horror. He thought about his parents, who'd been so proud when he got this job, about his kid sister, Amanda, back home in California. The name coincidence felt less random now, felt like a hook in his gut pulling him towards something inevitable. The rational choice was clear. Stay inside, survive, report it in the morning to people who would nod sympathetically and do nothing. Live with the guilt, but live nonetheless. Matthew started the truck and drove north toward the old-growth trail. The sun was touching the horizon when he found the first bonfire. It wasn't burning yet, just a careful stack of wood arranged in a clearing he'd never seen before, though he'd patrolled these trails dozens of times. The trees here grew wrong, twisted in ways that suggested ancient damage or deliberate cultivation. Symbols had been carved into their bark, designs that hurt to look at directly. Celtic knots corrupted into geometries that seemed to writhe at the corner of his vision. A mask hung from a low branch, crude, made of burlap and twine with eye holes torn rather than cut. More masks dotted the surrounding trees, a gallery of empty faces watching the unlit bonfire. Matthew's radio crackled. "Unit 7, this is base. What's your 20? He didn't recognize the voice. It wasn't Maria or Dale or any of the rangers he'd met. The voice was flat, affectless, and something about it made his skin crawl. "Unit 7, respond." He turned the radio off. The forest was changing as twilight deepened. The bird sounds he'd grown accustomed to had ceased entirely, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to have weight, to press against his eardrums like water pressure. The temperature was dropping fast, too fast. His breath misted in front of him and frost was forming on the carved symbols, making them stand out in sharp relief. He found the second bonfire a quarter-mile deeper into the forest. This one was burning. Had been burning for hours, judging by the bed of coals beneath the flames. The fire was wrong. Too blue, too cold-looking despite the heat he could feel radiating from it. And the smoke didn't rise the way smoke should. It coiled and writhed like something alive, forming shapes that almost looked like reaching hands before dissipating. A sound reached him through the trees, chanting, multiple voices moving in and out of harmony, speaking words in a language he didn't know but that resonated in his chest like a second heartbeat. The words felt old, felt heavy with meaning accumulated over centuries of repetition. Matthew followed the sound. The trail, if it could be called a trail, led him to a third bonfire and a fourth, arranged in what he realized was a vast circle encompassing several square miles of forest. The cult must have spent weeks, months, maybe years preparing this. Each fire was tended by a figure in a mask, standing motionless as a scarecrow, watching the flames with inhuman patience. None of them acknowledged Matthew's presence. He could have been invisible, or perhaps they simply didn't care. He was irrelevant to their purpose, as meaningless as any other witness the forest might host. The owls in the branches, the deer frozen at the clearing's edge, the wind moving through the dying leaves. The chanting was louder now, coming from somewhere ahead. Matthew checked his watch. 8:43 p.m. The witching hour was still far off, but he could feel something building in the air, a pressure like a storm about to break. He found Amanda Rodriguez at 9:15. She was unconscious but alive, bound to a stone that shouldn't exist, a dolmen, an ancient altar, in a forest that supposedly had no human history before the 1800s. She was dressed in a white robe, and her hands had been marked with symbols drawn in what looked like ash and blood. Around her, in a circle perhaps 50 feet in diameter, stood 13 figures in masks. The masks were all different, some crude, some elaborate, some that might have been antiques, others that looked freshly made, but all shared the same empty, staring quality, the same sense of something waiting behind the burlap and wood and leather. The 13th figure, standing at Amanda's head, wore a mask made from a human skull. "You shouldn't be here, Ranger." The voice came from the skull-faced figure, muffled but clear, male, older, with the confidence of absolute authority. "This doesn't concern you." Matthew's hand went to his hip, but his service weapon felt suddenly inadequate, a child's toy brought to a nightmare. "Let her go." "She's already gone, marked and measured and found acceptable." Do you know how hard it is to find them? The right name, the right age, the right time. It has to be perfect. The old ones are particular about their offerings. There are no old ones. You're just murderers hiding behind superstition. The skull-faced man tilted his head, and even without seeing his face, Matthew could feel the smile behind the bone. You don't believe? On this night, of all nights, when the veil is thin and the dead walk and the ancient powers remember what they once were, you should believe, Ranger. You will believe. You'll see what waits in the spaces between life and death, and you'll understand why we do this, why we've always done this. The other 12 figures began to move, circling the altar in a slow, deliberate pattern. Their chanting resumed, but now Matthew could hear the layers in it, voices speaking over and under and through each other, creating harmonies that shouldn't be possible with human vocal cords. The sound seemed to vibrate in his bones, to make his teeth ache and his vision blur. The bonfires around them were growing brighter, their blue flames reaching higher. And in their light, Matthew saw things that couldn't be there. Shadows that moved wrong, that stood upright when nothing was there to cast them. Faces in the smoke, watching with hungry eyes. The trees themselves seemed to lean inward, as though the forest was a living thing, a vast entity drawing breath before speaking some terrible word. Midnight, the skull-faced man said. When the veil is thinnest, when Samhain's power is absolute, then we'll call to them and they'll answer and she'll pass through. And in return we'll receive what they've promised us. Another 5 years, another cycle, another chance to transcend. Matthew drew his weapon. Step away from her. All of you. Now. No one moved. The chanting continued. I will shoot. You could, the skull-faced man agreed. You could kill me, maybe even a few of the others. But you're one man with one gun, and we are Legion. We are the inheritors of traditions older than your civilization, older than the concept of law you think protects you. We are what remains when civilization falls away, when the veneer of modernity cracks and reveals the howling void beneath. And tonight, on this night when the boundaries fail, we are untouchable. The chanting reached a crescendo, and Amanda stirred on the stone. Her eyes opened, unfocused, drugged, and she tried to speak. Only a whimper emerged. Matthew fired into the air. The gunshot was swallowed by the forest, muffled to insignificance. The chanting didn't stop. The cult didn't flinch. He fired again, this time at the nearest cultist. The bullet should have struck center mass, but it went through as though the figure was made of smoke. The cultist turned to face him, and behind the mask Matthew saw nothing. Not a face hidden by shadow, but an absence, a void where a person should be. His radio crackled to life despite being turned off, multiple voices speaking over each other, some male, some female, some that might have been human once but had degraded into something else. Too late, too late, too late, the hour comes, the veil thins, the old ones wake. Matthew ran toward Amanda, weapon drawn, but the cultists moved to block him. They were faster than they should be, more coordinated, moving as a single organism rather than 13 individuals. Their hands reaching out to stop him were wrong, too many fingers, joints bending in impossible directions. He fought anyway, struck out with the gun, with his fists, with desperate fury, connected with something that felt like burlap wrapped around rotten meat. Heard laughter that came from everywhere and nowhere, that echoed off the trees and seemed to originate inside his own skull. They didn't hurt him. That was somehow worse. They simply held him, their grip gentle but unyielding, and turned him to face the altar. Watch, the skull-faced man commanded. Bear witness. That's why you're here, after all. That's why they always leave a ranger on duty. Someone has to remember. Someone has to carry the story forward, even if they can never tell it. The clock on Matthew's watch showed 11:59. The bonfires erupted skyward, columns of blue flame that seemed to tear holes in reality. The chanting reached a frequency that made Matthew's ears bleed, made his vision swim with shapes and colors that didn't belong in the visible spectrum. Amanda was screaming now, fully conscious, struggling against bonds that seemed to tighten rather than loosen. And then midnight struck. The forest changed. Later, Matthew would struggle to describe what he saw, would wake screaming from dreams where he tried and failed to capture it in words. The trees became something else, bones perhaps, or pillars holding up a sky that had suddenly revealed itself to be a membrane, a thin layer separating this world from something vast and hungry. The cultists' masks fell away, but what was revealed beneath was not human faces. They were gaps, absences, places where reality had been scooped out and filled with something that predated matter and energy. The dolmen began to glow with the same blue light as the fires, and the symbols carved into its surface moved, reconfigured themselves into new patterns that hurt to perceive. Amanda's screaming took on a different quality. Not just terror now, but transformation, as though her vocal cords were being retuned to frequencies human throats weren't meant to produce. From the spaces between the trees, from the gaps in reality that had opened when midnight struck, things began to emerge. Matthew's mind tried to interpret them as smoke, as shadow, as tricks of the light, but failed. They were more solid than that, more present, ancient and patient, and so utterly alien that his consciousness recoiled from fully perceiving them. The skull-faced man raised his arms. "Old ones, we offer you what was promised. Accept this sacrifice, this soul freely given." "She wasn't freely given." Matthew's voice was raw. "She didn't consent to this." "Consent?" The skull-faced man laughed. "The old ones don't care about consent. They care about names and timing and proper ritual. She was born with the right name on the right year to be the right age on this night. That's consent enough. That's destiny." The things from beyond were closer now, circling the clearing with movements that suggested they experienced time differently than linear beings, that they were simultaneously approaching and already here, and never having moved at all. Matthew could feel their attention on Amanda, cold and vast as the spaces between stars. And then he understood. The pattern, the names, the 5-year cycle. It wasn't random. The cult didn't choose their victims. The victims were chosen before they were born, selected by something with a perspective vast enough to see causality as a whole, to trace every branch of every decision tree, until they found the ones that led to this moment, this altar, this offering. Amanda Rodriguez had been doomed from the moment her parents chose her name. Every choice she'd made, every path she'd walked, had led her here. The cult were just shepherds, guiding the inevitable toward its conclusion. But if that was true, then Matthew's presence here wasn't random either. He'd been placed in this job, given this shift, left alone on this night, for a reason. He was part of the pattern too, woven into the same tapestry of fate that had doomed Amanda. The question was, what was his role? The cultists were beginning their final invocation, words in that ancient language pouring from their emptiness like water from broken vessels. Amanda's screams were subsiding, not from relief, but from surrender, as though some essential part of her was already crossing over, already claimed by the things that waited. Matthew's watch showed 12:03 a.m., November 1st, All Saints' Day, when the Catholic Church had tried to overlay its own traditions on the older, darker celebrations. But the old powers didn't care about Christian rebranding. They remembered. They always remembered. In his jacket pocket, Matthew felt something he'd forgotten he was carrying, the laminated card Maria had given him that morning. Stay inside after dark, lock the doors, do not investigate the bonfires. Not instructions, warnings, and beneath them in that faded handwriting, something he hadn't noticed before because the light had been wrong, because he hadn't been meant to see it until now. Another line, barely visible, the iron, always the iron, his belt buckle, his keys, the rivets in his jacket, the barrel of his gun, iron, the old protection, the metal that spirits feared, that cut through glamours and broke enchantments. Not the bullet, which had passed through the cultist like smoke, the iron itself. The cultists were reaching for Amanda now, preparing to lift her, to carry her through whatever threshold had opened at midnight. The things from beyond were moving closer, their attention focused entirely on the altar, on the sacrifice, on the fulfillment of the bargain. No one was watching Matthew. He moved before thought could stop him. ripped the iron buckle from his belt, the keys from his pocket, chambered a round in his gun not to fire, but to expose the iron barrel, ran toward the altar with these makeshift talismans extended before him like shields. The cultists turned, but too slowly. Their movements, so inhuman and swift before, were suddenly sluggish, as though the iron's presence had thickened the air around them. Matthew's buckle connected with the nearest figure, and it shrieked, a sound like metal tearing, like reality screaming at a violation of its laws. The figure dissolved, not dying but unmade, returned to whatever state it had existed in before the cult had given it false form. He reached Amanda, cut her bonds with the iron edge of his keys. The symbols on her skin hissed where the metal touched them, burning away like fog under sunlight. She collapsed into his arms, barely conscious, but alive, still human, still salvageable. No! The skull-faced man's voice was no longer controlled. You've broken the ritual, you've violated the covenant, the old ones demand their offering. Then they can take you. Matthew didn't know where the words came from, didn't know he was going to speak until they emerged. But as soon as he said them, he felt something shift. The attention of the things from beyond, which had been fixed on Amanda with predatory focus, swiveled, regarded the skull-faced man. Considered. That's not how this works, the skull-faced man said, but his voice was uncertain now. I'm the priest, I'm protected, The things moved. What happened next, Matthew would never speak of. Not because he'd been commanded to silence, but because language had no framework for it. No words adequate to capture the sight of a human being, or what had once been a human being, unmade by entities that existed outside the boundaries of space and time. The skull-faced man didn't die so much as he was edited out of reality, removed from the equation, his screams echoing across dimensions that human ears weren't meant to perceive. The other cultists fled, their forms, which had seemed so solid and terrible, blurred and scattered like startled birds. The bonfires began to dim. The things from beyond, perhaps satisfied with their substitute offering, perhaps simply losing interest now that the ritual had been broken, withdrew back into whatever spaces they inhabited. The forest was still wrong, would always be wrong, Matthew suspected, at least to him. But it was becoming more tolerable, more like the ordinary world of trees and earth and autumn night. He carried Amanda Rodriguez out of that clearing, through the ring of bonfires, following his GPS, even though the device kept insisting he was standing in the middle of terrain that didn't exist on any map. When he finally emerged onto a proper trail, the moon was setting and the eastern sky was beginning to gray with approaching dawn. Maria found them at 5:47 a.m., just as the sun was breaking the horizon. She pulled up in her truck, took one look at Matthew's face and the barely conscious woman in his arms, and started crying. "You went in," she said. "You actually went in. Someone had to. Dale said you wouldn't. He bet me $20 that the new guy would follow protocol, that self-preservation would win out." She laughed, a broken sound. "I should have known better. Should have recognized the look in your eyes yesterday, same look I used to see in the mirror before I learned to avoid my own reflection." They got Amanda to the hospital. She remembered nothing. Not the hiking, not the capture, not the ritual. The doctors diagnosed acute drug intoxication and kept her for observation. Her family arrived from Denver grateful and confused, and she was discharged 3 days later with no apparent lasting effects. The official report Matthew filed mentioned finding a missing hiker and discovering evidence of illegal activity in the northern forest. A subsequent investigation by park rangers found the stone circles, the carved trees, the locations of the bonfires. But no dolmen, no altar, no signs of cult activity beyond some elaborate vandalism that the Park Service attributed to teenage Halloween pranks. Dale Hutchins put in for early retirement. Maria transferred to a different park. Matthew stayed. He stayed because someone had to, because the pattern was real, even if the evidence vanished with the dawn. Because in 5 years, in 2027, there would be another Halloween, another Amanda, another attempt to fulfill the bargain that the cult had made with things that didn't forget. He stayed because he'd seen behind the veil, had witnessed what waited in the spaces between life and death, and he couldn't unknow that. couldn't pretend the world was the safe, rational place he'd believed it to be 4 months ago. He stayed because the iron had worked, because the old protections, the ancient knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of generations who'd known these forces were real. All of it was true. Which meant there were defenses, ways to fight back, methods to protect the innocent from the predations of the hungry dark. He spent his off hours researching Celtic traditions, Samhain rituals, protection symbols, the proper use of salt and iron and silver, the names and natures of entities that existed in the margins of reality. He learned Gaelic, read texts on ancient religions, corresponded with scholars who studied the intersection of folklore and genuine supernatural phenomena. Some nights when he was patrolling the northern trails, he still heard the chanting, still saw lights moving through the trees that weren't flashlights or campfires, still felt the weight of attention from things that watched from places human senses couldn't fully perceive. But he also found others. People like Maria, scattered throughout park services and law enforcement and academic institutions, who knew the truth, who carried their own scars from encounters with the inexplicable, who had decided that knowledge and preparation were better than willful ignorance. They formed a network, unofficial and unacknowledged, shared information about patterns and hotspots and dates when the veil grew thin, started marking their own calendars, preparing their own defenses, making their own plans for the next Halloween, the next Samhain, the next night when ancient bargains came due. Matthew never forgot Amanda Rodriguez, never forgot the sound of her screaming, or the feeling of helplessness as he watched the cultists prepare to feed her to their gods. Never forgot the skull-faced man's conviction that some fates were inevitable, that some people were born to be sacrifices, that the old powers would always get what they were owed. But he also never forgot that he'd saved her, that the pattern could be broken, that even against forces that existed outside time and space, humans could fight, could resist, could occasionally win. 5 years seemed both impossibly far away and terrifyingly close. Matthew Chen, no longer a rookie, no longer naive, continued his patrols of Blackwood National Forest. He strengthened the protections, learned the wards, marked the dangerous places with symbols that the old ones would recognize and respect. He recruited others to his cause, trained them in the knowledge that had nearly died with previous generations. And when October 31st, 2027 arrived, when another Amanda checked into the park with innocent plans for an autumn hike, Matthew would be ready. The cult might return. The old ones might demand their offering. The veil between worlds might thin as it always did on Samhain night. But this time, they would find him waiting, armed not with a service weapon in desperation, but with knowledge, preparation, and the grim certainty of someone who had seen the worst the universe had to offer and chosen to stand against it anyway. Because someone had to bear witness. Someone had to remember. Someone had to stand in the gap between the innocent and the things that hungered in the dark. And on that first Halloween night in Blackwood National Forest, Matthew Chen had learned that he was that someone. The pattern remained, but now, so did he. I hope this literary Halloween has haunted you. If you enjoyed this seasonal terror, consider following for more Halloween stories. Which moment of this cursed night terrified you most? What do you think really happened when the veil was thin? Happy Halloween. The manila folder landed on William Chen's desk with the hollow thump of bad news. October 31st, 2018, and the morning sun streaming through the ranger station windows seemed too cheerful for what lay inside. His supervisor, District Ranger Margaret Hollis, stood with her arms crossed, her face carrying the kind of gray pallor that came from sleepless nights and terrible realizations. "Read it," she said. All of it. William had been with Blackwood National Forest for 3 years, transferred from a decade of military service that had taken him from Kandahar to the Horn of Africa. He'd seen things that hollowed men out from the inside. He'd watched good soldiers break under pressure that crushed them like empty cans, but he'd never broken, not once. That was his gift, or his curse, an ability to remain steady when everything around him dissolved into chaos. Stone-faced William, they'd called him in the service. The man who didn't flinch. He opened the folder. The first page was a missing persons report dated October 31st, 2008. Sarah Mitchell, age 27. Last seen on the Widows Creek Trail at approximately 6:47 p.m. Extensive search conducted. No trace found. Case remains open. He flipped to the next page. November 1st, 2013. James Cordero, age 34, disappeared while camping near the Old Grove. Last contact via cell phone at 8:23 p.m. on October 31st. Search dogs lost the scent at the Grove's edge. Case remains open. William's jaw tightened as he continued through the file. October 31st, 2003. October 31st, 1998. October 31st, 1993. Different names, different locations within the park's 30,000 acres, but always the same date. Always Halloween night. Always without a trace. 15 cases, Margaret said quietly. Going back to 1978. All October 31st. All unsolved. Why wasn't this flagged earlier? William's voice carried the clipped precision of his military training. Different rangers, different decades. The pattern wasn't obvious until I started digitizing the old records last month. Most of these cases were written off as people getting lost, falling into ravines, animal attacks. The park's big enough to swallow people. She paused. But all on the same date? That's not coincidence. William studied a map included in the file, marked with red pins for each disappearance. They clustered in the northern section of the park, in and around an area the old-timers called the Hex Hollow, a depression in the landscape where 3 creeks converged and the oldest trees in the forest grew thick enough to choke out the sun even at noon. There's more, Margaret said, and her voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. Amanda Preston went hiking yesterday afternoon. Solo hiker, experienced, had all the right gear. She was supposed to check in with her sister by 8 p.m. last night. Never did. Her car's still in the Widows Creek parking lot. The same trail where Sarah Mitchell had vanished exactly 10 years ago. William closed the folder. Why are you telling me this? Why not bring in the FBI? Because it's Halloween, William. Because every local officer is dealing with vandalism calls and drunk college kids. Because the FBI would take 3 days minimum to mobilize, and if the pattern holds... She didn't need to finish. If the pattern held, Amanda Preston had less than 12 hours before whatever had taken the others took her too. You're the best tracker we have. You've got military search and rescue training and... She hesitated. And you don't believe in ghost stories. Should I? Margaret pulled a faded newspaper clipping from her pocket. The paper yellowed and brittle with age. The headline read, "Local woman hanged for witchcraft, 1692. The article detailed the execution of Constance Blackwood, for whom the forest was eventually named, on October 31st, 1692. According to the colonial records, she'd kept a black cat that townspeople swore could speak with human voice. After her death, the cat was never found, but livestock deaths and strange occurrences plagued the area for years. Local legend held that she'd bound her familiar to the land itself, and that every Halloween when the boundary between worlds grew thin, it hunted. Fairy tales, William said, tossing the clipping back onto his desk. Maybe, but 15 people are gone, William, and Amanda Preston is out there right now. If you're going to find her, you need to start before dark. William stood, already reaching for his tactical pack. Combat boots, GPS unit, first aid kit, satellite phone, emergency flares. The same gear that had kept him alive in hostile territory. I'll find her. Take this too. Margaret handed him a small cloth bag that smelled of herbs and smoke. Old Mrs. Kowalski from town dropped it off this morning. Said to carry it if anyone goes into the Hex Hollow today. It's got salt, iron filings, and dried rowan berries. Traditional protections. You can't be serious. Humor me. Humor her. She's lived here for 80 years, and she says the old families knew things. She says... Margaret's voice wavered. She says if you're out there after midnight, you'll need it. William took the bag with the same indulgent patience he might show a child offering him a lucky rabbit's foot. He clipped it to his belt anyway. Not because he believed, but because in the field, you learned never to refuse local knowledge entirely. Even superstition sometimes had roots in observable fact. By 10 a.m., he was on the trail. The Widow's Creek Trail wound through dense forest that seemed to press in from all sides. October in Pennsylvania meant the leaves had turned, carpeting the path in rust and gold, muffling his footsteps to whispers. The air carried the scent of decay, that particular autumn smell of things returning to earth. William moved with the economy of motion that military training had burned into his muscle memory. He scanned for broken branches, disturbed leaf litter, anything that might indicate Amanda's passage. Her file photo showed a woman in her early 30s with sandy blonde hair and laugh lines around her eyes. The photo had been taken at a trailhead, her backpack visible, a smile that suggested someone who found joy in solitude and trees. He'd find her. He'd extracted trapped soldiers from compounds under enemy fire. One lost hiker in a Pennsylvania forest was nothing. Except, the deeper he moved into the forest, the more he noticed the silence. No birdsong, no rustle of squirrels in the branches. The October woods should have been alive with animals preparing for winter. But instead there was only the sound of his own breathing and the soft crush of leaves beneath his boots. He checked his GPS. The device flickered, the signal wavering despite clear sky visible through the canopy. Technology glitch. Happened sometimes in heavy forest. By noon he'd reached the junction where Widow's Creek split into 3 tributaries. The Hex Hollow. The trees here were massive, old-growth oaks and chestnuts that had been saplings when the country was young. Their trunks were so wide that 3 men couldn't have joined hands around them. The canopy overhead wove together into a ceiling that reduced the midday sun to dim, greenish light. William found the first sign of Amanda 100 yards past the junction, a torn piece of fabric snagged on a blackberry bush. The color matched her jacket from the photo. He marked the location on his GPS and continued, following the faint trail. Broken twigs. A boot print in soft earth near the creek. She'd come this way. But so had something else. The second set of tracks made William stop. They were paw prints, but wrong. Too large for a dog, too splayed for a wolf. And Pennsylvania hadn't had a native wolf population in over a century. The prints appeared and disappeared seemingly at random, as if whatever made them had been leaping impossible distances between steps. He photographed them with his phone, noting that the camera's timestamp flickered between 12:47 p.m. and 00:00, the display glitching. Electronics failure. He'd file a report about potential magnetic anomalies in this area. The trail led him deeper into the hollow, to a clearing he didn't remember from any map. In the center stood a lightning-scarred oak, its trunk split and blackened, half dead but still clinging to life. Carved into the bark were symbols that made his eyes hurt to look at directly, spirals and crosses and shapes that seemed to writhe when seen peripherally. And at the base of the tree, arranged in a perfect circle, were jack-o'-lanterns, 14 of them, each carved with a different face, some grinning, some screaming, all with candles burning inside despite the afternoon light and the absence of any visitors who might have placed them here. The pumpkins had that fresh carved look, seeds and pulp still moist. But who would hike this deep into the forest to set up Halloween decorations where no one would see them? William approached carefully, his hand instinctively moving to his belt where he'd once carried a sidearm. Park rangers were allowed to carry, but he'd left his weapon at the station, thinking this was a search and rescue, not a combat operation. The 14th pumpkin was larger than the others, and its face was carved in perfect detail, eyes, nose, mouth all rendered with artistic precision. It looked almost like a portrait. He pulled out his phone to take a photo and felt his blood turn cold. The face carved into the pumpkin was Amanda Preston's face. He spun, scanning the clearing, his combat instincts screaming that he was being watched. Nothing moved. The forest remained silent, but he'd seen too much in war zones to ignore the prickling sensation between his shoulder blades, the ancient hindbrain warning that predators were near. Amanda. His voice echoed flatly, absorbed by the trees. Amanda Preston, if you can hear me, call out. No response, just the gentle hiss of wind through dead leaves. William examined the clearing more carefully. There, another piece of fabric, this one with blood on it. His trained eye assessed it as perhaps 2 tablespoons of blood, enough for a decent cut, but not life-threatening. The trail continued beyond the clearing, marked now with subtle signs: a disturbed mushroom patch, a freshly broken branch, and increasingly, those wrong paw prints. He pressed on. The afternoon wore on, the light growing thicker and more golden as the sun began its descent. By 4 p.m. he'd covered another 2 miles, following the trail deeper into territory even he'd never fully explored. The vegetation changed here, becoming twisted and strange. Trees grew in spiral patterns. Mushroom rings appeared with mathematical precision. And everywhere that oppressive silence. His satellite phone refused to connect. The GPS had given up entirely, the screen frozen on a cascade of error messages. He had a compass and map as backup. Old technology, reliable technology, the kind of tools that had guided soldiers for centuries before satellites. Except his compass was spinning. Slowly, but continuously, the needle rotating through all points without settling on north. That was impossible. Compasses didn't do that. Even near strong magnetic deposits, they'd point consistently toward the disturbance. They didn't just spin like a lazy casino wheel. For the first time since entering the forest, William felt something he hadn't experienced in his entire military career: the cold touch of genuine unease. He was trained for combat, for survival, for navigating hostile territory with unreliable intelligence. But this defied his understanding of how the world worked. And things that defied understanding were things that could kill you. The sun touched the horizon at 5:47 p.m., and the forest changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the quality of light, the green-gold afternoon darkening to bruised purple. The temperature dropped precipitously, his breath suddenly visible in clouds. And from somewhere distant, or perhaps somewhere very close but somehow muffled, came a sound that raised every hair on William's neck. A cat's yowl, but huge, reverberant, carrying a timbre that no cat should possess. It sounded almost like a human scream shaped into feline vowels, and it echoed through the hex hollow with deliberate malice. William unslung his pack and pulled out his high-powered flashlight. The beam cut through the gathering dusk, illuminating trees that now seemed to lean inward, their branches like grasping fingers. He also pulled out the bag of herbs and iron that Margaret had given him, opened it. The smell of the contents was sharp, almost acrid. "Superstitious nonsense," he muttered. But his hands, acting on some instinct deeper than rational thought, began sprinkling a thin line of the mixture in a circle around his position. As the sun disappeared completely and true night fell over the forest, William heard voices. They came from the direction he'd been traveling, multiple voices overlapping, some calling for help, others screaming, still others whispering in languages he didn't recognize. He strained to hear words and caught fragments. "Help me, please, God, it's following. Thought I saw the trail, but it just keeps... Not an animal. It's not an animal, it stands up and... Amanda!" William shouted into the darkness. "Amanda Preston!" The voices stopped abruptly, cut off as if by a switch. In the silence that followed, he heard something moving through the underbrush. Not thrashing, not stumbling. Moving with fluid purpose, circling his position. He swept his flashlight beam across the trees and caught a reflection. 2 eyes, gleaming yellow-green, positioned about 4 feet off the ground. Cat eyes, but far too large, each the size of a fist, and containing an intelligence that made his stomach clench. The eyes blinked slowly, deliberately. Then they were gone. William's training took over, the calm detachment that had kept him alive in firefights and ambushes. He marked time, assessed threats, formulated plans. The presence, whatever it was, had circled his position 3 times now, always staying just beyond the reach of his flashlight, testing him, evaluating. At 8:23 p.m., his flashlight beam caught something tied to a tree branch about 20 yards from his position. A piece of fabric fluttering in the breeze. Amanda's jacket. He recognized the color and the tear pattern from the earlier piece he'd found. It was bait. Every instinct told him it was bait. But Amanda Preston was out here, alive or dead, and he was her only chance of getting home. William stepped over his circle of salt and iron, moving toward the jacket. The moment his boot crossed the line, the forest erupted with sound. The voices returned, dozens of them now, screaming and pleading and laughing with manic intensity. The cat yowl came again, so close it seemed to vibrate inside his chest cavity. And from the darkness ahead, just beyond his flashlight's reach, came footsteps, human footsteps, walking in a slow, measured cadence. "Amanda?" William called, his voice steady despite the adrenaline singing through his veins. "Is that you?" "William Chen." The voice that answered was feminine but wrong, the tone too flat, the pronunciation too precise. "Military service 2001 to 2015, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Meritorious Service Medal. The man who doesn't break." It knew him. It knew his name and his history. He aimed his flashlight at the source of the voice. Amanda Preston stepped into the light. She looked exactly like her photo. Same sandy blonde hair, same outdoor gear, even the same smile. But her eyes were wrong. They reflected the flashlight beam like an animal's, that yellow-green shine that shouldn't exist in human eyes. And she moved wrong. Her gait too smooth, her joints bending at angles that made his combat-trained brain scream warnings. "You're not her," William said flatly. The thing wearing Amanda's form tilted its head, the movement too far, neck pivoting like an owl's. "Aren't I? I have her memories. I know she was afraid when night fell. I know she called for help. I know she ran and ran and ran until her legs gave out." The smile widened, too wide. "I know how she tasted." William's hand went to his belt, fingers closing around the fabric pouch. Not a weapon, but perhaps... "You're the familiar," he said. "The witch is familiar. Constance Blackwood's cat." The Amanda thing laughed, the sound layered with that yowling cat scream. "The good people of 1692 hanged my mistress on this night, bound her in iron, burned her body and scattered the ashes. But It took a step closer, and in the flashlight beam, William saw its shadow on the trees behind it. Not human, but something four-legged and massive, with a lashing tail. I was bound to this land. Every October 31st, when the veil grows thin, I walk, I hunt, I collect. The disappearances, all of them. All of them. Another step closer. 15 souls, 15 shapes I can wear. Would you like to see?" The figure flickered. Amanda Preston became Sarah Mitchell, became James Cordero, cycled through face after face. 15 missing people, 15 identities consumed and cataloged. With each transformation, the yellow-green eyes remained constant, watching him with predatory interest. "What do you want?" William asked. His military training had covered interrogating enemy combatants, negotiating with tribal leaders, managing hostile encounters. Nothing in that training had prepared him for negotiating with something that shouldn't exist. "What I've always wanted, freedom. My mistress bound me to this land to walk only one night per year, but there are old bargains, old prices." The familiar wore Amanda's face again now, but made no attempt to hide its true nature. 16 souls collected over 16 Halloweens, that was the number required. 16 to break the binding, to walk free under any moon. Amanda Preston is number 15. She was. The thing's smile was terrible. "You're number 16, William Chen, the man who doesn't break. The perfect final payment. Think of it, I chose you. Your supervisor sent you here on this specific day, led by my careful arrangement. The missing hikers, the pattern revealed at precisely the right moment. I've been preparing this trap for years." William felt the weight of understanding settle over him. The files Margaret had just discovered last month. The timing of Amanda's disappearance. Even his own transfer to this park 3 years ago, getting him into position for this moment. How long had this thing been arranging the pieces? "I'm not going to make it easy for you," he said. The familiar laughed again. "I never expected you would. That's why I chose you, soldier. The ones who break easily aren't suitable for the final binding. I need strength, I need will. I need someone whose spirit has been tested and refined. It took another step, and now William could smell it. Not Amanda's perfume, not human scent at all, but something animal and ancient and other. Run if you like. Fight if you must. It doesn't matter. You're in the Hex Hollow on Halloween night, and the veil is thin. This is my place, my time, my power. William did what he'd been trained to do. He assessed the tactical situation. He was outnumbered, 1 versus 1, but the one possessed capabilities he couldn't match. Outmaneuvered, the familiar knew this terrain intimately, and outgunned, no weapons effective against something that shouldn't exist. In combat, when every advantage went to the enemy, you created chaos. You changed the rules. He hurled his flashlight directly at the familiar's face and ran. Behind him, that terrible cat scream split the night. William crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at his clothes, his combat boots finding purchase on uncertain ground. He had no light now, only the faint illumination of a moon just beginning to rise, and the forest had become a maze of shadows and obstacles. But he'd run night operations in Afghanistan. He'd evaded Taliban patrols in mountain darkness. He knew how to move when moving meant survival. The familiar pursued. He could hear it behind him, sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on 4, the sound of its passage changing with its form. And it was playing with him. He realized that with cold clarity. It could have caught him already if it wanted. It was hurting him, driving him toward some destination of its own choosing. William changed direction, angling away from where the thing wanted him to go. He vaulted a fallen log, splashed through a creek that wasn't on any of his maps, and emerged in another clearing. This one had 13 jack-o'-lanterns arranged in a circle. The faces were the same he'd seen earlier, minus Amanda's. And in the center of the circle, tied to a stake like a parody of a witch burning, was Amanda Preston. The real Amanda Preston. She was alive. He could see her chest rising and falling, but unconscious. Her blonde hair was matted with blood from a head wound, and her exposed skin was covered in scratches and what looked like bite marks. Small bite marks, cat-sized. "You found her!" The familiar's voice came from the darkness behind him, delighted. "I knew you would. You're a rescuer, after all. It's what you do." William approached Amanda carefully, scanning the perimeter. This was another trap, obviously, but what choice did he have? Leave her here to be this thing's sacrifice? He reached Amanda and began working on her bonds. The ropes were old, fraying, tied with knots he didn't recognize. As his fingers worked, Amanda's eyes fluttered open. "Run," she whispered, her voice raw from screaming. "It's been all day, playing games. Run. I'm not leaving you. Stupid soldier, stupid brave, it wants both of us." The familiar stepped into the clearing, and now it made no attempt to maintain a human form. What entered the circle of jack-o'-lanterns was something that hurt to look at directly, a shape that flickered between cat and woman and something that was neither. Its size fluctuated, sometimes small as a house cat, sometimes large as a tiger. The only constants were those yellow-green eyes and the intelligence burning within them. "You were always going to choose her," the familiar said. "That's who you are, the protector, the rescuer, even when you know it's a trap." It began to circle them, its form solidifying into something resembling a massive black cat with too many joints in its legs. "My mistress chose me because I understood the hearts of humans. I've had 300 years to study your kind. You're all so predictable." William got the last of Amanda's ropes free and pulled her to her feet. She could barely stand, leaning heavily against him. Both of them in the center of the circle now, surrounded by grinning jack-o'-lanterns and a creature from a nightmare that shouldn't exist. Midnight. The familiar purred. 3 hours until midnight, when the veil is thinnest and the old bargains can be fulfilled. Until then, let's play. It attacked. William had faced enemy combatants, had been in close quarters combat more times than he could count. But nothing in his training had prepared him for fighting something that moved faster than thought, that flickered between solid and shadow, that struck from impossible angles. He felt claws rake across his shoulder, tearing through his jacket. felt teeth, too many teeth, snap closed on his arm. He rolled, came up swinging, his fist connecting with something solid enough to hurt his knuckles. The familiar yowled and withdrew, circling again. Amanda screamed as the thing darted past her, leaving 3 parallel cuts across her cheek. William positioned himself between her and the creature, falling back on infantry tactics. Protect your squad, hold the line, give no ground. But this wasn't a line that could be held. The familiar was everywhere and nowhere, attacking from angles that defied geometry, its form shifting too rapidly to track. William felt more cuts open across his back, his legs, his arms, nothing fatal, nothing immediately debilitating. It was bleeding them. Slowly, carefully. 23 confirmed kills in your military career, the familiar said conversationally as it circled. Hand to hand, 5. You're formidable, for a human. But you're playing by human rules. I'm not human, William Chen. The attack came again, and this time William was ready. As the familiar lunged, he pulled the pouch of salt and iron from his belt and flung the contents directly into its face. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The creature recoiled, screaming in a voice that was simultaneously cat and woman and a dozen other throats. Its form destabilized, flickering rapidly between shapes. Where the mixture had struck its fur, or skin, or whatever it was made of, wisps of smoke rose. Iron, it hissed. Old magic, small magic, weak magic. But it kept its distance now, circling more cautiously. You can't have much of that left. And the night is young. William looked at Amanda. She was barely conscious, shock setting in from blood loss and trauma. They needed shelter, needed defensible ground, needed... He remembered the circle, the one he'd made around his earlier position, the salt and iron line. He'd stepped over it to pursue Amanda's jacket, but it might still be intact. Can you run? He asked Amanda. She nodded weakly. Try. They ran. The familiar pursued, but more carefully now, wary of any remaining protective materials William might have. They crashed through the forest, William half carrying Amanda, his combat conditioning the only thing keeping him moving despite his own injuries. He found his earlier position by sheer luck, or perhaps by something else, some quality of the night itself that was guiding him. The circle of salt and iron was still there, undisturbed, a thin line of protection in the darkness. They stumbled across it, and immediately the difference was palpable. The oppressive weight of the night lessened slightly. The voices that had been whispering from the trees grew fainter, and when the familiar approached, it stopped at the circle's edge, pacing like a caged animal. Clever, it admitted, but temporary. The circle won't hold past midnight. When the veil is thinnest, no barrier can contain me. It sat, a massive black cat now, tail lashing. So we wait. I've waited 300 years. I can wait 3 more hours. William checked his watch. 9:47 p.m. 2 hours and 13 minutes until midnight. He tended to Amanda's wounds as best he could with his first aid kit, binding the worst of the cuts, cleaning the bites. She was going into shock, trembling despite the thermal blanket he wrapped around her shoulders. 15 people, she whispered. I saw them, when it held me. I saw them in its eyes. They're still alive somehow, trapped inside it, screaming. William looked at the familiar, still sitting patiently beyond the circle. The souls you collected, you didn't just kill them. Of course not, the familiar said. I consumed them, took their forms, their memories, their very essence. They're part of me now. And at midnight, when I take you both, I'll have everything I need. 16 souls to break the binding. 16 sacrifices on 16 Halloweens, spread across 3 centuries of patience. Why this specific number? Why 16? The familiar's yellow-green eyes gleamed with something like satisfaction at being asked. Even ancient predators, William realized, enjoyed explaining their superiority. My mistress was the 16th woman hanged in these colonies for witchcraft. The binding she placed on me required 16 to break, a symmetry, a mathematical completion. one for each year she walked the earth after her power manifested. 16 Halloweens, 16 souls, and I walk free. William's mind raced through the tactical problem. They were trapped in a circle that would fail at midnight. The familiar was immortal or near enough. They had no weapons effective against it. His satellite phone was dead, his GPS useless, and they were miles from any help. In combat, when conventional tactics failed, you fell back on psychological warfare. You found your enemy's weaknesses and exploited them. You've been planning this for 3 centuries, William said slowly, waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect victims. But you're still bound, still a slave to your mistress's spell, even now. The familiar's form rippled with anger. I am no slave. I serve no one. Then why wait? Why not simply take souls at random? Why this elaborate ritual? William pressed, watching the creature's reaction. Unless the binding has rules you can't break, unless you're more limited than you want us to believe. Careful, soldier, the familiar hissed. You're bleeding. Your protection fades. Don't make me angry when I could make your death quick. But William had seen the truth in its reaction. The familiar was bound by rules, by the structure of the original spell. It could only hunt on Halloween. It could only take souls in the Hex Hollow. And perhaps, there were other limitations. The jack-o'-lanterns, he said. 14 of them in the first clearing, 13 here. 1 for each soul you've taken. They're not decorations, they're anchors. You need them to maintain your hold on the consumed souls. The familiar's tail lashed faster. Clever again, but knowing changes nothing. What happens if they're destroyed? The silence that followed was answer enough. William looked at Amanda, saw understanding dawn in her eyes despite her shock. The souls would be freed, she whispered. Wouldn't they? If the anchors are broken, the magic breaks. The familiar launched itself at the circle, slamming against the barrier of salt and iron with physical force that sent shockwaves through the air. You will not touch them. Those souls are mine. William pulled his emergency flare from his pack. Red phosphorus, burns at 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, more than hot enough to incinerate carved pumpkins. 3 hours until midnight, he said. Plenty of time to run back to those clearings and destroy your anchors. You can keep us trapped here, or you can chase me while I burn your collection, but you can't do both. The familiar's form flickered wildly, rage and calculation warring across its inhuman features. It could abandon its vigil and stop him from reaching the jack-o'-lanterns. But that would mean leaving Amanda alone in the circle, and there was no guarantee it could stop William in time. Or it could maintain the siege and hope to take them both at midnight, but risk losing everything if William escaped. You're bluffing, the familiar said, but uncertainty edged its voice. William lit the flare. It burst to life with a brilliant red glow that threw stark shadows across the clearing. Try me. For a long moment, creature and man stared at each other across the barrier of salt and iron. Then William stepped over the circle, moving toward the direction of the nearest jack-o'-lantern clearing. The familiar moved to intercept, but William had expected that. He didn't run toward the clearing. He ran parallel to it, forcing the creature to choose between blocking his path or rushing ahead to protect the jack-o'-lanterns. It chose to block. The familiar materialized in front of him, massive and terrible, all pretense of cat form abandoned. What faced William now was something from the darkest folklore. A chimera of feline and human and other things, standing on hind legs that bent backward, arms ending in claws like curved daggers. You want to die heroically? It snarled. Fine, I'll make it legendary. They fought. William had no illusions about winning a direct combat engagement. The familiar was stronger, faster, more durable, but he'd fought insurgents in the Hindu Kush, had survived ambushes where every metric said he should have died. Combat wasn't always about strength. It was about will, about refusing to quit, even when your body screamed at you to stop. He used the flare like a weapon, jabbing at the familiar's face, the burning phosphorus making it recoil. He rolled under a swipe that would have disemboweled him, came up running, changed direction as claws raked the air where he'd been. Blood poured from a dozen wounds, his own and the few he'd managed to inflict with fists and boots in the flare. And slowly, painfully, he led the familiar away from Amanda, away from the circle, away from the protective ground, because William Chen, the man who didn't break, understood something the familiar had missed. This wasn't about him surviving. It was about Amanda surviving, about the 15 souls trapped inside this creature getting free. Sometimes the mission required sacrifice. The familiar seemed to realize his intent too late. It lunged, catching William's shoulder in jaws that felt like a bear trap, slamming him to the ground. He felt ribs crack, tasted blood, saw the creature's face descending toward his throat. And then Amanda hit it with a burning branch from what was left of William's flare. She'd crawled out of the circle, barely able to stand, using the branch like a club. The familiar shrieked and wheeled on her. William, through a haze of pain, saw his moment. He grabbed the creature from behind, wrapped his arms around what passed for its torso, and held on. "Run!" he shouted at Amanda. "Find the jack-o'-lanterns. Destroy them." She hesitated for only a moment, then stumbled away into the darkness, carrying the flare. The familiar thrashed, trying to shake William loose, but he'd been trained in restraint techniques, knew how to maintain a hold even against superior strength. He felt claws shredding his back, felt the creature's body shifting and writhing against his grip, but he held on. "You're dead," the familiar hissed. "Dead, dead, dead. I'll consume you slowly. I'll make it last hours." "Worth it," William managed, his vision going gray at the edges. They struggled in the darkness, creature and man, predator and prey. William felt his strength failing, felt his grip beginning to slip. The familiar was too strong, too inhuman. But he'd bought time, maybe enough time. From somewhere in the distance came Amanda's voice, triumphant and terrified at once. "I found them." The familiar went berserk, throwing William off with desperate violence. He hit a tree hard enough to knock the air from his lungs, slid to the ground unable to move. The creature bounded away toward Amanda's voice, its form elongating as it ran. William dragged himself upright. Every movement was agony. Broken ribs, definitely. Deep lacerations across his back and arms, possible internal bleeding. But Amanda needed more time. He forced himself to run, following the familiar's path. He emerged in the clearing with 13 jack-o'-lanterns, just as Amanda touched the flare to the nearest pumpkin. It burst into flame with a sound like a human scream. The familiar convulsed, its form becoming unstable. Where the jack-o'-lantern had been, something else was emerging, a translucent figure barely visible in the firelight. Sarah Mitchell, the first victim. Free. No! The familiar lunged at Amanda, but William intercepted, tackling it mid-leap. They crashed into another jack-o'-lantern, and it too caught fire. Another scream, another soul emerging like smoke from a bottle. The familiar was weakening, its form flickering between shapes rapidly now. 300 years, it wailed. 300 years of patience. Amanda moved through the circle systematically, touching the flare to each jack-o'-lantern. With each one destroyed, another soul emerged and the familiar diminished, its massive form shrinking, its power draining. By the 8th jack-o'-lantern, it was cat-sized again. By the 11th, it could barely hold physical form. William's watch read 11:53 p.m. 7 minutes to midnight. The last jack-o'-lantern was the largest, the one carved in Amanda's likeness. She paused before it, looked at the creature that was now barely more than a shadow with yellow-green eyes. "You were bound to this land by your mistress," she said. "But she's been dead for 300 years. You could have been free. You could have let go. Instead, you chose to keep killing, keep consuming, keep hunting." She touched the flare to the pumpkin. "I hope whatever comes next you find peace, but not here. Not like this." The final jack-o'-lantern ignited, and the familiar's scream split the night. It was a sound of rage and loss, and something that might have been relief. Its form came apart like smoke in wind, the yellow-green eyes dimming, fading, finally going dark. The 15 souls, all of them, transparent and ethereal but undeniably present, stood in a circle around the clearing. They looked at William and Amanda, and one by one they nodded. Thanks or acknowledgement or goodbye. Then they faded, not destroyed but released, free to go wherever souls go when they're no longer bound. The oppressive weight lifted from the forest. Somewhere a bird sang, impossible at midnight but happening anyway. The temperature rose to normal October levels, and when William checked his phone, the time read 11:59 p.m., and the GPS signal was back, showing their location precisely. They'd won. Barely, bloodily, but they'd won. Amanda collapsed and William caught her, both of them too wounded and exhausted to do more than sit in the dirt among the burning pumpkins. In the distance, he could hear sirens. Someone, maybe Margaret, had sent search and rescue. Or perhaps the forest itself had called for help, now that the familiar's influence was broken. At exactly midnight, as October 31st became November 1st, William felt something shift in the air. The veil closing again, the boundary between worlds becoming solid once more. The dead returning to their rest, the living claiming the daylight. He'd survived. Amanda had survived. And 15 souls were free. When the rescue team found them 20 minutes later, William was unconscious from blood loss. But he was smiling. He woke 3 days later in a hospital, his body covered in stitches and bandages. Margaret sat by his bedside, her face haggard with relief. "Amanda?" he asked, his voice cracked from disuse. "Alive. Recovering. She's been asking about you." Margaret hesitated. "William, what happened out there?" The rescue team found the clearings, found the burned pumpkins. But there were no signs of any animal attacks, no tracks except yours and Amanda's. They're calling it a shared delusion brought on by hypothermia and stress. William closed his eyes. Let them call it what they wanted. He knew the truth. He'd faced something that shouldn't exist and survived. "The disappearances?" he asked. "There's been a development. Bodies. They found bodies. All 15 missing people, in locations throughout the Hex Hollow. Like they'd been there all along, but somehow hidden." Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. "The coroner says they all died on October 31st, their respective October 31sts. But they're all in perfect condition, like they died yesterday. It doesn't make sense." It made perfect sense if you understood that the familiar had been keeping them preserved somehow, their souls trapped while their bodies waited. Now the souls were free, and the bodies could finally rest. "And the legends?" William asked. "Mrs. Kowalski's stories?" Margaret smiled weakly. "She came by yesterday, brought you flowers and another one of her protective charms. She said you'd need it, that surviving Halloween doesn't mean you're safe. The old families remember things," she said. "They remember that some debts pass down through generations and some hunts never truly end." William thought about that as Margaret left, letting him rest. The familiar was gone, destroyed. But witchcraft was real. The supernatural existed. The veil between worlds thinned every Halloween, and who knew what else might walk through. He was still thinking about it a week later, when he returned to duty, limping but alive. He'd filed his report, a sanitized version about an aggressive wildlife encounter and a successful rescue. No one believed it entirely, but no one could prove otherwise. On his desk, he found a new folder, missing persons cases from other national parks. He opened it reluctantly, already knowing what he'd find: patterns, dates, disappearances clustered around specific times of year. Not just Halloween, but other days when tradition said the veil grew thin. Midsummer's Eve, the winter solstice, Walpurgis night. Whatever he'd faced in the Hex Hollow, it wasn't unique. It was just one thread in a much larger tapestry of things that shouldn't exist but did. William Chen, the man who didn't break, looked at the evidence of horrors he'd never imagined existed before that Halloween night. He thought about the 15 freed souls, about Amanda's survival, about his own scars that would never fully fade. Then he started reading the files, Because someone had to. Someone had to stand watch. Someone had to face the things that came through when the veil grew thin. He'd been a soldier. Now he was something else. A guardian against threats that most people didn't believe in and couldn't fight. It was going to be a long career. Outside his office window, the November sun shone bright and clean, burning away the last remnants of Halloween fog. But William knew the truth now. There were older, deeper darknesses than any November sun could reach. And every year, on October 31st, those darknesses would rise again. He just had to be ready when they did. The folder stayed open on his desk. The first case was in Oregon, dated December 21st, the winter solstice. 5 disappearances over 20 years, all on the longest night of the year. William picked up the phone and called Margaret. "I'm going to need more of Mrs. Kowalski's charms," he said. There was a long pause on the line. Then, "I'll make the arrangements." "William, are you sure about this?" He looked at his reflection in the office window. The new scars, the harder eyes, the man who'd gone into the Halloween forest believing in training and tactics, and emerged knowing that faith and folklore sometimes mattered more. "I'm sure," he said, because stone-faced William, the man who didn't break, had found his new mission. The world was wider and stranger and more dangerous than he'd ever imagined, but that just meant it needed guardians who understood that truth. He'd survived Halloween 2018. He'd face whatever came next. The Hex Hollow stood empty now, the jack-o'-lanterns reduced to ash, the familiar destroyed. But in shadows and forgotten places, other things waited. Other ancient bargains sought fulfillment. Other nights of power approached. And when they came, William Chen would be ready. The dead could rest now. The living would keep watch. That was enough. The end. I hope this Halloween literary experience has haunted you. The familiar is destroyed, but the scars, both physical and psychological, remain. What moment terrified you most? The discovery of the pattern? The familiar wearing stolen faces? The midnight confrontation? Happy Halloween. And remember, the veil grows thin again next October 31st. The morning of October 31st, 2014, broke cold and gray over Blackwood National Forest, the kind of autumn dawn that promised an early dusk. William Mercer stood in the ranger station, pouring his third cup of coffee while his colleague Danny Chen decorated the bulletin board with paper bats and plastic spiders. William snorted, shaking his head at the display. "You know we're not an elementary school, right?" William said, his voice dripping with the particular condescension he reserved for what he called superstitious nonsense. He was 43, lean and weathered from 2 decades of park service, and prided himself on being the most rational man in 3 counties. Danny didn't look up from tacking an orange streamer across the weather alerts. "It's Halloween, Will. Lighten up. Besides, the kids doing the nature hike this afternoon will love it." "Halloween," William muttered, returning to his incident reports. "Celtic New Year, Harvest Festival, All Hallows Eve. You know what it really is? Marketing. Corporate America selling plastic masks and diabetes." He'd given this speech before, many times, especially during his 22 years at Blackwood. Every October 31st brought the same tired parade of local legends, the same warnings from the old-timers in town, the same ridiculous protocols that the previous station chief had implemented before his retirement. "You don't believe any of the stories?" Danny asked, finally turning around. He was young, barely 26, still green enough to find wonder in the forest, rather than just seeing acres to patrol and tourists to manage. "Stories." William's laugh was sharp. "You mean the Witch of Blackwood? The one who supposedly cursed this place 300 years ago? Danny, I've worked Halloween night for 22 straight years. You know what happens? Teenagers try to drink beer at the Overlook. Someone always forgets to douse their campfire properly, and I spend 8 hours doing exactly what I do every other night." 22 years? Danny's eyes widened. "And nothing strange?" "Nothing strange," William confirmed, sipping his coffee. "No ghosts, no goblins, no familiars prowling the woods. It's a forest. Trees, animals, geology, that's it." He gestured at the mandate posted on the wall, the one requiring rangers to work in pairs on Halloween night, to carry salt and iron, to mark their routes. This superstitious garbage, it's a liability, makes us look unprofessional. The radio crackled. Sarah's voice came through from the north checkpoint. Base, we've got the Hamilton group checking in for their overnight permit. Should be setting up at Ravens Point by nightfall. William picked up the radio. Copy that. Remind them about fire safety and food storage. And Sarah, don't mention the holiday nonsense. We're rangers, not tour guides for a haunted hayride. There was a pause, then, Will, it's tradition. The old protocols exist for a reason. The old protocols exist because Chief Morrison was superstitious and probably senile, William shot back. Just do your job. He set the radio down harder than necessary. Danny had stopped decorating, watching him with an expression William couldn't quite read. You know Jennifer Martinez is hiking solo today, right? Up to the old burn area near Hangman's Hollow. William frowned. Jennifer was a regular, a 34-year-old wildlife photographer who knew the park better than most of his rangers. But hiking solo on Halloween to that particular area, why would she go there today? She said something about the light being perfect this time of year. And Danny hesitated. She wanted to photograph the witch stones. The witch stones. A circle of rocks near the site where, according to local legend, a woman named Abigail Cord had been executed for witchcraft in 1714. The historical records confirmed a woman had died there, but William had always assumed it was just another tragic case of colonial paranoia. The curse that supposedly followed was pure folklore, embellished over generations of campfire tales. Jennifer's a grown woman with a permit, William said. She can hike wherever she wants. Even on Samhain? Danny's voice was quiet. William's jaw tightened. Don't call it that. It's October 31st, a date on a calendar. He grabbed his jacket and park radio. I'm doing the southern perimeter check. You handle the nature hike group when they arrive. As he stepped outside, the cold hit him immediately. It was colder than the forecast had predicted, cold enough that his breath misted heavily. The parking lot was empty except for his truck and Danny's sedan, but someone had been busy. 3 jack-o'-lanterns sat on the split-rail fence at the forest entrance, carved with elaborate, almost professional detail. Their triangular eyes seemed to track him as he approached. William hadn't authorized any decorations outside the station. He examined the pumpkins more closely, looking for a card or signature. Nothing. The carvings were strange too, not the simple faces he remembered from childhood. These featured spirals and symbols he didn't recognize, cut deep into the orange flesh, and they were positioned in a line pointing toward the trail that led north, toward Hangman's Hollow. Danny, he called back toward the station. Did you put these here? Danny emerged, took one look at the pumpkins, and went pale. No, Will, those weren't there when I arrived an hour ago. Well, someone put them here. William examined the ground. No footprints in the frost-crisp grass except their own and the tire tracks. The pumpkins hadn't been there when he'd driven in at dawn. He was certain of that. Probably teenagers getting an early start on mischief. But even as he said it, something about the jack-o'-lanterns bothered him. The way they were positioned with such precision, the symbols carved into them, the fact that they pointed like an arrow toward the most remote section of the forest, toward where Jennifer was hiking. Will, we should follow protocol, Danny said. Partner up for today. The old rules. Our nonsense, William interrupted, but his conviction wavered slightly. He pulled out his radio. Jennifer Martinez, this is Ranger Mercer. Do you copy? Static. Jennifer, if you're receiving, please respond. Checking on your position. More static than a burst of white noise that might have been a voice, distorted and faint. The radio crackled out entirely. Atmospheric interference, William said, though he'd never had this much trouble with the radios before. I'll drive out to Hangman's Hollow, make sure she's okay. You stay here and manage the station. Will, that's an order, Danny. William climbed into his truck, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking lot. In his rearview mirror, he saw Danny standing by the jack-o'-lanterns looking worried. Behind Danny, barely visible in the tree line, something black moved. William's eyes snapped back to the mirror, but whatever he'd seen was gone. Just shadows, just branches in the wind. He drove north on the park road, passing the campground where a few die-hard campers were setting up for the night despite the cold. The forest pressed close on both sides, and as the morning wore into afternoon, the sky never seemed to brighten. The gray ceiling of clouds hung low, pregnant with the threat of rain or worse. This was bear country, mountain lion territory, a landscape that demanded respect. But it wasn't supernatural. It was ecology, weather patterns, the simple mechanics of wilderness. The radio in his truck crackled occasionally, bursts of static that sounded almost like words, almost like whispers. William ignored it, focused on driving. He'd reach Hangman's Hollow in another 20 minutes, confirm Jennifer was fine, maybe give her a friendly warning about hiking solo, and head back before the day trip tourists arrived for their Halloween photo opportunities. That's when he saw the second jack-o'-lantern. It sat in the middle of the road, right at the turnoff for the Hollow access trail. William slammed the brakes, his truck skidding slightly on the gravel. The pumpkin was identical to the ones at the station, the same spiral symbols carved deep, positioned to face him directly. Its candle was lit, the flame burning bright despite the outdoor wind. William got out of the truck slowly. The forest was utterly silent. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Just silence and that steady flame inside the jack-o'-lantern, flickering but never extinguishing. "This isn't funny," he said aloud, his voice sounding strange in the stillness. He walked toward the pumpkin, intending to kick it off the road. As he got closer, he noticed something inside it. Not just a candle, but something else, something dark and wet. He knelt down, peering through the carved eyes. The interior of the pumpkin was full of dead birds, dozens of them, small songbirds with broken necks, arranged in a precise spiral pattern around the candle. Their eyes were gone. William jerked back, his heart hammering. This was vandalism, animal cruelty, something he could report and investigate through proper channels. It wasn't supernatural. There was no such thing as magic, curses, familiars. There were only sick people doing sick things. But his hands shook as he pulled out his radio. "Base, this is Mercer. I've found... Danny, we may have a situation. I need you to contact Sheriff Morrison. Tell him we might have someone in the park engaging in animal cruelty. I'm continuing to Hangman's Hollow to check on Jennifer Martinez." The radio gave back only static, thick and suffocating. Through it, he thought he heard laughter. Children's laughter. William got back in his truck, left the jack-o'-lantern in the road, and drove faster than he should have on the winding trail. The trees seemed darker now, despite it being only early afternoon. The gray light had taken on a strange quality, as if the sun was setting prematurely. He checked his watch. 2:47 p.m., hours until actual sunset. But the forest disagreed. A third jack-o'-lantern appeared at the next bend, then a fourth, then a fifth, each one positioned on the trail like breadcrumbs, each one lit, each one pointing him forward. William didn't stop to examine them. His earlier confidence was eroding, replaced by something he refused to name as fear. It was just concern. Professional concern for a missing hiker and whoever was playing these elaborate pranks. The turnoff to Hangman's Hollow appeared on his right, marked by a wooden sign and inevitably another jack-o'-lantern. This one was larger, carved with particular artistry. The face seemed to shift as William's headlights passed over it, the expression changing from welcome to warning. The road became too narrow for his truck. William parked, grabbed his flashlight, radio and pack, and started hiking. The trail climbed steeply through old-growth timber, the kind of ancient forest that had stood for centuries. The witchstones were another mile ahead, in a small clearing where lightning had sparked a fire 30 years ago, leaving the area partially scorched and haunted by dead snags. Every 50 yards, another jack-o'-lantern waited, each one lit, each one fresh. William counted 16 of them by the time the trail leveled out. His rational mind screamed that someone had to have carried them here, carved them, positioned them. But when? How? He'd patrolled this area just 3 days ago and seen nothing unusual. The forest's silence deepened. Not even wind moved through the branches. And then William heard it. A sound like wind chimes, delicate and clear. But there were no wind chimes in Blackwood National Forest. The sound came again, closer, and he realized it was too organic to be metal. It sounded like small bells or bird calls or laughter. William spun, his flashlight cutting through the gray afternoon. Nothing, just trees and shadow and the trail of jack-o'-lanterns behind him, all burning with that impossible steady flame. "Jennifer!" he called out. "Jennifer Martinez, are you out here?" The laughter came again from his left this time. Definitely a child's laugh. Multiple children, playing in the forest. But the parking area had been empty. No school groups were scheduled, and the sound had a strange quality. Slightly wrong, like hearing a familiar song played at the wrong speed. William's radio crackled. Through the static came a voice, female, terrified. "Can't find the trail. Darkness everywhere. Something following." "Jennifer, is that you? What's your position?" William demanded. "The stones. The witch stones. Oh God, it's..." The transmission cut off with a sound like breaking glass. William ran. His 22 years of park service took over, his boots finding purchase on the rough trail, his breathing measured despite the altitude and fear. He had to find Jennifer. Whatever was happening, whatever sick game someone was playing, a woman was in trouble and he was responsible for this park. The trail opened into the clearing. William stopped so suddenly he nearly fell. The witch stones formed a perfect circle, each rock marked with more of those spiral symbols, though these looked far older, weathered by centuries. In the center stood Jennifer's camera on its tripod, lens pointed at the circle. Her backpack lay nearby, contents spilled across the dead grass, but Jennifer herself was nowhere visible. And surrounding the clearing, positioned with mathematical precision, were 37 jack-o'-lanterns. William's mind tried to process it, to find the logical explanation. Someone had done this. A group of people working quickly for reasons he couldn't fathom. It was elaborate, certainly criminal, possibly dangerous, but it wasn't supernatural. It couldn't be. "Jennifer!" His voice echoed strangely in the clearing, as if the space was larger than it appeared. "Jennifer, where are you?" One of the jack-o'-lanterns went dark. Then another. Then another. They extinguished in sequence, creating a pattern, a spiral moving inward toward the witch stones. William's flashlight seemed dimmer, struggling against the encroaching darkness, even though by his watch it was only 3:15 p.m. The last jack-o'-lantern to go dark was the one at the northern edge of the clearing. As its flame died, something moved in the trees beyond it. William's flashlight beam found it, and his breath caught. A cat, just a black cat, sitting on a fallen log, watching him with eyes that reflected his light in an amber glow. But no house cat should be this deep in the forest, and no cat he'd ever seen had eyes quite that shade, quite that bright. "Here, kitty," William said automatically, stupidly. The cat tilted its head and he could have sworn it smiled. Then it spoke. Not meowed. Spoke. In a voice like wind through dead leaves, it said, "She's ours now. The familiar takes what's offered. But you, William Mercer, you who mock the old ways, you who scorn the thin times, you may still choose." William's flashlight fell from his hand, hit the ground, rolled. The beam spun crazily across the clearing, briefly illuminating Jennifer. She stood inside the circle of witch stones, but not standing normally. She floated, suspended 3 feet above the ground, her head thrown back, her mouth open in a silent scream. Her skin had taken on a gray pallor like stone, like she was transforming into something ancient and lifeless. William tried to move, to run to her, but his legs wouldn't obey. The black cat jumped down from the log and walked toward him, its movements liquid and wrong, joints bending at impossible angles. As it came closer, it grew. First to the size of a dog, then larger still, until it stood as tall as a man, walking on 4 legs that looked more like shadows than flesh. 22 Halloweens, the creature said, its voice multiplying into a chorus. 22 Samhains you've worked these woods. 22 times you've walked past our signs, ignored our warnings, mocked our feast. The witch knew you would come. Abigail Cord sees all who disrespect her grave. This isn't real, William whispered. Hallucination. Carbon monoxide. Something in the water. The familiar laughed, and the sound was every cat he'd ever heard yowling in heat. Every screech of brakes before a collision. Every child crying in the night. The veil is thin, denier. On this night we cross. On this night what was bound becomes free. And the disrespectful, the mockers, the fools, and they feed the familiar. More shapes emerged from the trees. Not one cat, but dozens. Hundreds. A flowing tide of black fur and amber eyes, moving in perfect synchronization. They circled the clearing, and where their shadows touched, the jack-o'-lanterns reignited one by one, but burning with a blue flame now, cold and terrible. William finally managed to move, stumbling backward, reaching for his radio. It crackled with that same child's laughter, now clearly malevolent. Through the static came voices, dozens of them, speaking in unison. The familiar feeds, the familiar grows, the familiar takes what Samhain allows. Jennifer's body jerked in midair, her eyes snapping open but showing only white. Her mouth moved, and impossibly her voice came from all around him. I thought I could photograph them, capture proof. I stayed after sunset on purpose. I wanted to see if the stories were true. Will, the stories are true. The stories are so true, and it hurts. It hurts to become. Her words dissolved into a scream that came from the earth itself. The massive cat thing lunged. William threw himself sideways, rolling through dead leaves and dirt. He grabbed his flashlight, swung it like a weapon. The beam caught the creature full on, and for just a moment he saw its true form. Not a cat at all, but something older, something made of shadow and malice and ancient hunger, wearing the shape of an animal like a person might wear clothes. Iron, William gasped, remembering the old protocols, the superstitious rules he'd mocked, the rules that mentioned cold iron and salt. He fumbled in his pack. Did he have anything? His knife, his ranger knife with the steel blade. The familiar struck again, faster than anything living should move. William felt claws rake across his shoulder, tearing through his jacket, his shirt, his skin. The pain was immediate and white-hot, but worse was the cold that followed, seeping into the wounds like ice water into cracks. He fell, hit the ground hard, tasted blood and earth. The familiar loomed over him, and he could see into its eyes now, see the intelligence there, the cruel patience. This thing had waited through decades of William's patrols, his mockery, his disrespect. It had marked him, learned him, prepared for this moment when the veil would thin enough to act. Your choice, the familiar said, and now its voice was almost gentle. Accept what you've denied. Feed the witch's servant willingly, and we'll let your death be clean. Or fight, disbelieve to the last, and we'll make you watch as Jennifer transforms. We'll make you understand every moment of your unmaking. William's hand found his knife, drew it. The blade was steel, not iron, but maybe close enough. Maybe the old protocols had some truth in them, some kernel of wisdom beneath the superstition. Go to hell, he managed. The familiar's laugh was like shattering ice. Hell? Mortal, we came from somewhere far older. It lunged again, and William raised the knife, a desperate gesture, and the blade caught the creature's forelimb. The familiar shrieked, a sound that shattered the remaining jack-o'-lanterns, sending flaming pumpkin flesh in all directions. Where the steel had cut, the shadow flesh hissed and bubbled, a wound that glowed with a sickly yellow light. Ironkin, the familiar spat. Steel kissed with the old blood. You carry protection unknowing. William didn't understand, didn't care. He scrambled to his feet, knife held out, backing toward Jennifer. If he could reach her, if he could cut her down from whatever force held her. The small cats, the hundreds of them, closed in tighter. Their eyes blazed in the darkness that had swallowed the clearing, turning afternoon into a premature midnight. But they didn't attack. They watched. Waited. "The veil closes at dawn," the large familiar said, changing tactics, circling him. "But midnight strengthens us. At midnight, when Samhain peaks, when the old witch's death hour tolls, then we can cross fully. Then we can feast until spring." William checked his watch reflexively. 6:47 p.m. Hours until midnight. An eternity. "What do you want?" "Belief," the familiar said simply. "Acknowledgement. The mockery breaks our bindings, keeps us weak. But fear, and respect, those empower us. Every year, more forget, more scoff, more deny. But tonight, on the 300th Halloween since Abigail Cord was murdered for practicing the old ways, we require recompense, a believer to replace her." Jennifer came willingly, fool that she was. "But you will craft into something better. A warning, a reminder, a ranger who mocked and was broken." Jennifer screamed again, and William saw her hands had turned completely to stone now, gray and lifeless. The transformation was spreading up her arms. "No," William said, and meant it, felt it. Every cell of his rational mind rebelled, but what choice did he have in the face of evidence? The impossible was happening. The supernatural was real. His worldview, his certainty, his 22 years of smug disbelief. All of it crumbled like the jack-o'-lanterns around him. "I believe," he said, hating himself. "I believe in the curse. I believe in the familiar. I believe the old ways had power." The familiar tilted its massive head. "Do you? Or do you merely lie to save your skin and hers?" William looked at Jennifer, saw her agony, saw the stone creeping across her chest toward her heart. He thought of Danny back at the station, probably trying to raise him on the radio. He thought of all the warnings he'd dismissed, all the protocols he'd called foolish. He thought of the knife in his hand and the superstitions about iron and steel. "I believe," William said again, "that you're a goddamn animal, and I'm a park ranger." He threw the knife. It wasn't a good throw. William had never been trained in knife throwing, and his wounded shoulder made his arm weak. But the blade tumbled through the air, caught firelight, and by pure luck, or perhaps something else, it struck the familiar's chest. The creature exploded into 1,000 shrieking forms, black birds erupting in all directions, wings beating the air into chaos. The smaller cats scattered, becoming smoke, becoming shadow, becoming nothing, and Jennifer dropped, falling hard to the earth inside the witch circle. William ran to her, pulled her out from between the stones. Her skin was still partially gray, still partially transformed, but her eyes opened and met his. "You heard it," she gasped. "But you can't kill it. Not really. It's not alive the way we understand. It's bound to this place, to the witch's bones, to Halloween itself." "Then how do we survive?" William asked, checking her pulse, her breathing. She was alive but cold. So terribly cold. "Salt," Jennifer said. "Fire. The old protections. They're not superstitions, Will. They're instructions. Recipes for survival passed down because they work." William looked around the clearing. The jack-o'-lanterns were mostly destroyed, but some still burned with that cold blue flame. And in his pack, he had emergency flares. Road salt for his truck in winter. "Can you walk?" he asked Jennifer. "I don't think so. My legs." She looked down, and he followed her gaze. Her feet were still stone immobile weights. A sound rose from the forest, a howling that came from every direction. The familiar was reforming, calling its pieces back together. They had minutes at best. William poured the salt in a circle around them, using every packet from his emergency kit. Then he lit 3 flares, planting them in the ground at equal points. The red flame was chemical. modern, but it pushed back the darkness with fierce authority. In folklore, Jennifer said, her voice weak, the familiar serves the witch, Abigail Cord, but she's dead. She was hung and burned 300 years ago. So what's it really serving? William's mind raced. 300 years ago, October 31st, 1714. Tonight was the anniversary. 300 years to the day. It's serving itself, he realized. Using her name, her power. But the witch is long gone. This thing has been free for centuries, just waiting for the veil to thin enough. Not free, Jennifer corrected. Bound. That's why it needs permission, acknowledgement, belief. That's why it tries to make us feed it. It's still bound by the rules of her death, her trial. The rules that said black cats were evil, that Halloween was dangerous, that magic required sacrifice. The howling grew closer, harmonizing into a voice. Clever prey, clever disrespectful prey. But midnight comes. Midnight always comes. And then the veil tears wide. William checked his watch. 9:13 p.m. Less than 3 hours. The salt circle and flares might hold until then, or they might not. The forest pressed in, darker than any night should be, and he could see shapes moving in that darkness, circling, patient. His radio crackled. Through the static, impossibly, came Danny's voice. Will, if you can hear this, if you're still alive, the old chief left protocols, real ones, in the station safe. I'm reading them now. To break the familiar's binding, you need to... Oh God, Will, you need to destroy the witch stones. They're not a memorial. They're a cage. The binding was tied to them, and as long as they stand, it can't fully die but can't fully live. It's trapped between. But if you break the circle... The transmission dissolved into interference. William looked at the stones. 7 of them, each as tall as his waist, covered in those spiral symbols. Break them. He had a climbing hammer in his pack, small but solid. He had his remaining strength. He had perhaps a death wish after 22 years of arrogant disbelief. If I leave the salt circle to break the stones, he said to Jennifer, the familiar will attack. Yes, she agreed. And if I break the binding, it might become fully free instead of being destroyed. Also, yes. William laughed, a sound edging toward hysteria. So our choices are stay here until midnight when it definitely kills us, or risk freeing it completely in the hope that breaking its binding breaks its existence. Those appear to be our options, Jennifer said. Her voice was getting weaker. The stone had stopped spreading, held at bay by the salt and flame, but it hadn't receded either. From the darkness, the familiar called, William Mercer, who denied the mysteries. Will you deny them even now? Even as they tear you apart? Screw you, William muttered. He picked up his hammer, kissed Jennifer's forehead, which was still warm, still human, and stepped over the salt line. The attack was immediate. The shadows coalesced into forms. Cats, yes, but also ravens, foxes, things with too many legs and eyes in wrong places. They swarmed him from all sides, biting, clawing, tearing. William swung the hammer wildly, running for the nearest stone. Pain exploded across his back, his arms, his face. Blood ran hot down his neck. He reached the first stone and swung. The hammer connected with a sound like thunder. The stone cracked, and from the crack spilled light. Actual light, warm and gold, as if sunrise had been trapped inside for 3 centuries. The familiar shrieked and recoiled. In that moment of reprieve, William ran to the second stone, swung, cracked it. More light burst forth. No! The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. You'll kill us both. The binding sustains us. The witch and the familiar locked together, only the veil between. Break it and we both dissolve. Good, William gasped, reaching the third stone. His vision was blurring from blood loss. His shoulder was a mass of agony, but he swung again and again and... The stone shattered. The light erupted like a solar flare spreading across the clearing. William heard screaming, not from the familiar but from something else, something older, a woman's voice furious and betrayed. "He was mine, my companion, my power. You trap us together and now you dare." "Abigail Cord," William said, understanding flooding through him. "You're still here. You and your familiar bound together by your death, neither dead nor alive, waiting for freedom or vengeance." He saw her then, in the golden light spilling from the broken stones. A woman in colonial dress, her face beautiful and terrible. A noose still around her neck. Beside her stood the familiar in its true form. Not a cat, but something serpentine and winged. Scales black as midnight. 300 years, Abigail said. "I've waited for someone to complete the ritual, to sacrifice themselves willingly, and let us walk free again. But this girl chickened out." She gestured at Jennifer. "And you mock but act. You disbelieve but fight. You're wrong for the working entirely." "Then let us go," William said. He gripped the hammer tighter, eyeing the remaining stones. 4 more. "Your curse is broken, your familiar is exposed, it's over." "Over?" Abigail laughed, and it was the sound of grave dirt falling on coffins. "Fool. If you destroy the remaining stones, the binding doesn't just break, it reverses. We don't dissipate. We solidify. We become real again, flesh and blood and power. The curse completes." William's hand faltered. "You're lying. Am I?" Abigail moved closer, and where she walked, frost spread across the ground. "Why do you think the old chief protected these stones? Why do you think the protocol said to avoid them, never to damage them, to respect them? Not because they were dangerous, because they were a prison. And you, Fool Ranger, are about to open the cell." William looked at Jennifer. Her eyes were wide with terror, her stone feet cracking, pieces falling away as something new emerged beneath. Not flesh, but roots, tendrils, like she was becoming part of the earth itself. "Will," she whispered, "I don't think she's lying." The familiar hissed, its voice sharp. "Destroy them all and we take form. Keep them standing and we haunt these woods forever, bound but hunting. Your choice, denier. Free us to walk the world or contain us here to feed on fools like you until the sun burns out." William's mind raced. Either option was catastrophic. But there was a third choice, one he was only beginning to understand. He looked at his watch. 11:47 p.m., 13 minutes to midnight. "What happens at midnight?" he asked. Abigail and the familiar exchanged a glance. Neither answered. "I'll tell you what I think," William continued, stalling, thinking. "I think midnight is when the veil is thinnest, when the binding is weakest, when you can almost taste freedom. But it's also when the old rules are strongest, when Halloween is most itself, when belief and ceremony have maximum power." He backed toward the center of the circle, toward Jennifer. "And I think you need me to choose wrong. Either shatter all the stones and free you, or leave them standing and feed you. But there's a third option, isn't there? One you're not telling me about." "There is no third option," the familiar snarled. But there was something uncertain in its voice now. William knelt beside Jennifer, touched the stones he'd already broken. The light still poured from them, and he felt something in that light. Warmth, yes, but also sadness. The trapped sunlight of long ago dawns, Halloween mornings when the veil closed and the world returned to normal. "Dawn," he said. "I just have to survive until dawn. The veil closes, Halloween ends, and you go back to being powerless ghosts with no ability to hurt anyone." Abigail's face contorted with rage. "You can't survive 13 minutes. We'll tear you apart." "Maybe," William agreed. "Or maybe I can do what no one's done before. Maybe I can believe in you while also believing in myself. Respect your power while still opposing it. Maybe that's the lesson. Not denial and not capitulation, but acknowledgement with resistance." He stood, placed himself between Jennifer and the witch, and held out his bleeding arms. "I believe in you, Abigail Cord. I believe you were wronged, executed for powers you possessed, bound unfairly with your familiar. I believe your anger is justified." The witch hesitated, surprised. "But I also believe you've become something worse than your executioners," William continued. "You've hunted innocent people for 3 centuries. You've turned your justified rage into mindless cruelty. And that I won't accept, I won't enable." He checked his watch. 11:54 p.m. "6 minutes," he said. "I can last 6 minutes." The witch screamed, and the familiar lunged, and the clearing became a maelstrom of shadow and fury. But William stood his ground, using his knife when the familiar got close, using his hammer to knock back the smaller creatures that swarmed. Jennifer pulled herself up, stone-footed but determined, and grabbed a burning branch from the flare. Together, they fought. Not to win. You can't win against ghosts and curses. But to survive. To outlast. William's watch hit 11:59 p.m. 30 seconds. The familiar wrapped around him, crushing, squeezing air from his lungs. Abigail's frozen hands closed on Jennifer's throat. The forest itself seemed to scream. And then, church bells. Distant but clear, from the town 15 miles away, ringing midnight. The familiar convulsed. Abaiga's form flickered like a candle in wind. All around them, the shapes and shadows began dissolving, pulled back toward whatever realm they'd escaped from. "Not again," Abigail wailed, her voice fading. "Not another year." 300 years, William said through bloody lips. "Maybe that's enough." The final bell tolled. October 31st became November 1st. Halloween died, and with it, the thinned veil slammed shut like a door. The clearing fell silent. William collapsed, Jennifer beside him. Around them, the witch stones stood. 3 broken, 4 intact, no longer glowing. Just rocks. Just geology. The jack-o'-lanterns had gone dark, their candles extinguished. The forest was a forest again, ordinary and alive with the sounds of night birds and distant wind. "We survived," Jennifer whispered. "We survived," William agreed. They lay there, bleeding and broken, until dawn came. Real dawn, the sun rising pink and gold over Blackwood National Forest. With the light came the sound of engines. Search and rescue Danny and Sarah and a team from town, coming to find their missing rangers. Danny found them first, took one look at William's shredded clothes and Jennifer's stone-cracked feet and said, "Next Halloween, you're following the protocols." William laughed, which hurt, but felt necessary. "Next Halloween, I'm writing the protocols." They carried Jennifer out on a stretcher. Her feet returned to flesh over the next 3 days, though she walked with a limp forever after. William's wounds healed slowly, leaving scars that ached every October 31st, a reminder written in scar tissue. The broken witch stones were left alone, per William's new directive. The intact ones were marked with warning signs and protected by fence. The clearing at Hangman's Hollow was closed to the public permanently. But every Halloween night, rangers still patrol in pairs. They carry salt and iron. They mark their routes carefully and never mock the old warnings. Because William Mercer, once the most skeptical man in 3 counties, now knows better. He knows that stories are sometimes histories, that legends can be instructions, that the veil between worlds thins once a year, and on that night belief matters more than evidence, respect matters more than proof, and survival matters most of all. Jennifer never returned to Blackwood. She moved to the coast, took up landscape photography instead of wildlife work, and never spoke publicly about what happened. But she sent William a card every November 1st, always with the same message. "We made it through. See you next year." As for William, he stayed at Blackwood National Forest until his retirement. Every October 31st he worked. Every Halloween night he patrolled the trails, checked the witch stones, and watched the darkness. Sometimes he saw jack-o'-lanterns that hadn't been there at dusk. Sometimes he heard children's laughter from empty trails. Sometimes a black cat watched him from the trees with knowing eyes. But the familiar never attacked again. The witch never manifested. Because William had learned the lesson that saved his life. Acknowledge the darkness without feeding it. Respect the mystery without surrendering to it. Believe in the impossible while fighting to survive it. That's the ranger's duty on Halloween. Not to deny or to capitulate, but to stand guard at the threshold, to hold the line between the living world and whatever lies beyond the veil. And on cold October nights, when the moon hangs full and the leaves crackle underfoot, William Mercer stands at that threshold still, one foot in skepticism and one in belief, protecting the forest and the people who walk through it, until dawn comes and Halloween dies again. The jack-o'-lanterns glow in the darkness, marking paths to places no one should go. But they're just pumpkins, William tells himself. Just symbols, just a holiday tradition. Most of the time, he even believes it. The end. I hope this Halloween tale haunted you appropriately. If you enjoyed this supernatural terror, consider what really lurks in the thin places between worlds. What moment terrified you most? Do you think William truly escaped, or is he still marked by that Samhain night? Happy Halloween.